Month, and this year the conference theme embodies the goals and mission of the University of Wyoming Black Study Center and is entitled Reframing the Traditional Master Narratives Through Evidence-Based Research. So my name is Maya Tsogo Onana. I'm a graduate student at the University of Wyoming. I transferred from France and I major in American Studies. I also work with Dr. Dixon as a teaching assistant this semester for his course entitled African American History. And I also partake in events such as this one. And as Dr. Dixon would say, I'm here in hopes to challenge the mainstream narrative. So today I'll have the honor of introducing our keynote speakers and student presenters. So first of all, we can welcome Dr. Jacqueline Bridgman, who has been a member of the University of Wyoming College of Law faculty and adjunct faculty in African American and Diaspora Studies since 2002, and is the Director of School and Culture and Social Justice. Dr. Bridgman will offer opening remarks to the subject. Welcome to you, Dr. Bridgman. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maya. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you might be watching this from. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the 5th annual Black History Month Student Research Conference. This is always one of my favorite events of the year because the students have wonderful presentations and I'm always so impressed with the depth and breadth of the work they undertake and the level of excellence with which they execute their work. More and more in the current political climate in which we find ourselves, people question why it is important to have a Black Studies Center. Why is it important to teach things like African American studies? Why is there a need for an entire month, even if it's the shortest month, dedicated to the study and remembrance of Black history? Many of those who offer such criticisms claim to do so on the basis of facts like such things divide us, or continuing to bring up that history makes some folks feel bad, or those things are in our distant past and are better left there, or whatever similar kinds of iterations of those arguments might be. Yet day after day, week after week, month after month, we get reminders of the racism that still exists in our society. We see the stark inequalities and continuing social problems that we can't solve and all the rest. In another aspect of my life, when I'm not at the law school or running the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice, I'm a magistrate judge for our local juvenile drug court. And in that capacity, I have occasion to think a lot about how people overcome trauma, how they deal with their troubled past, and how they begin to heal and move forward in a positive way. When I was in court this past week and thinking of such things, and then thinking about my opening remarks for this conference, it occurred to me that the United States in some ways is a lot like the kids I see in drug court. It has a lot of trauma and past hurts and problems from which it needs to heal. As we talk about in drug court, healing cannot happen when one is in denial. Healing cannot happen when one does not know and understand one's full and true authentic self. Accordingly, if the United States really and truly does want to become a nation where all are valued and all are equal, and where one's race or gender or other bases of identity does not define or circumscribe one's life chances, then it has a lot of healing to do. That healing cannot happen if we are in denial of who we really are, if we discount and try to set aside our histories that inform and tell us who we are today. That healing can't happen if we don't understand our true selves and effectively deal with that past trauma and use that to find a way to move forward together. One way we do that is through education and through conferences like this and the kinds of projects that these students are doing. This kind of work not only prevents us from living in harmful denial, it helps us bring to the spotlight the areas we need to work on. It helps us understand and accept ourselves better, and in so doing, find positive ways forward that move us toward a place of healing and reconciliation. Work that benefits not just those from whom we'll hear today, but all of us as a collective and interdependent whole. So with that, I welcome you to this year's conference. I thank Dr. Dixon for all his hard work, not just on this conference, but all the many things he does all day. I like to thank others who helped put on all of these events, like Toby Thompson and the many students that are involved, as well as the ones you'll hear from today. So welcome to our 5th year of this conference, and I look forward to learning with all of you for the rest of the time we have together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bridgman. Next, we'll have Dr. Frederick Douglass Dixon. Frederick Douglass Dixon is the director of the University of Wyoming Black Studies Center, and he will present a tribute to the father of Black History Month, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Dixon, the floor is yours.
Greetings, all. I'm sorry for the delay. We want to discuss Dr. Carter G. Woodson and his importance to history, his importance to Black History Month, and to get this overarching view of what we owe him as a tribute. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, born in 1875, was the second Black man to graduate Harvard University with a PhD, but the first historian, son of slaves. That means a lot, the son of slaves. And most times we collect that with Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was not the son of slaves. So when we talk about Dr. Carter G. Woodson, what he wanted, one of the major goals of Negro History Week in February 1926 was to understand and to inject the accurate accomplishments of Blacks into the tapestry of American history. So that's a tall feat in 1926. What's going on in 1926? Where the eugenics movement is going on, the lynching movement is going on. So what Dr. Carter G. Woodson is up against and what he's combating is this dehumanization of Black life. So he looks at it in a realm that talks about scholarly endeavors, and what he looks at is this idea of doing hard work that will uplift the masses of Blacks through intellectual prowess. So in many ways, what Dr. Carter G. Woodson does for us, he allows for us to look at his legacy and say how much of a visionary he was, how he looked at where we would be today, February 3rd, 2023, and allow for us to understand this vision is beyond 1 week. It's beyond 1 month, but this is the tapestry of America that we're changing. So we're looking at ameliorating, and we're looking at this idea of multiple perspectives. Now, when we think about multiple perspectives, lots of folks talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. Some talk about critical race theory. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was above all of that. His way of looking at it would inject immediately a change that had to be noticed. So for us to understand today, while we're here, his vision becomes the clearest and the most empirical point that we can look at to say, thank you, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, for allowing us to be here. Job well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Next, we'll have Dr. Richard Benson II from the University of Pittsburgh, who is Associate Director of the Center for Urban Education and Associate Professor of the Black Radical Tradition in Education in the Department of Educational Foundations, Organization, and Policy. Dr. Benson will give the keynote address. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning to everyone, depending upon where you are on the planet. Thank you for being here to the University of Wyoming Black Studies Center, Dr. Dixon, all those attendants. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to share my work, and definitely look forward to adding to what I hope will be a conversation based on the exciting programming that you have scheduled for today. Not sure who's dealing with the tech stuff. Is there a possibility for me to be able to share my? If not, I don't necessarily need to, but I had a few slides that I just wanted to show for this talk that I'm going to give this morning, noon, etc. So if that's a possibility, please let me know and allow me to share my screen. Thank you. I'm not sure if it's being shared right now. If it's not, I'm just going to go ahead and walk us through. So the title of my talk this afternoon is essentially one that I think is most appropriate given the theme and the aim of the conference, because I've always been of the mind, and my work has always pointed in the direction of looking at the role of not just Black studies, but the role of institution building that emanates and evolves out of what we identify as the Black freedom movement, but more specifically the latter half of the 1960s that is often misidentified as almost kind of like the wayward twin of the civil rights movement that wasn't appropriated, which we identify as Black power. So what I want to do is speak to the role of Black student radicalism and the legacy of Black studies as a political project that had essentially aims to be an anti-racist innovation in order to challenge the role of cultural depravity as related to all things that weren't aligned with what was thought to be a part of dominant cultural society or whiteness. So with that, you have not just higher ed, but Black studies itself became a tool of organizing for what we identify essentially as PE, or political education. So the title of this talk is Black Student Radicalism and the Legacy of Black Studies. So the thing that I'm going to do today, I'm going to provide a lot of text for our investigation after the presentation, for you to look into, for you to check my sources, to you to research whatever the research is that I provided to you for the presentation. And I think it behooves us to continue study within the legacy and tradition of not only Black studies, but essentially for what it was established for, which was to push back against or to challenge hegemony at all levels, be it systemic, institutional, whether it's in the form of liberation movements, whether it's in the form of combating illiteracy, or as Charles Johnson, for the first PC for the first People's College that came out of Fisk University, would often state that the PC is teaching those how to read. So in this sense, in the legacy of Black studies, from a critical perspective, this presentation is about teaching people not only how, but most importantly, what to read and how to be critically conscious. So I began the presentation talking about the Highlander Folk School. And in that, the reason that I bring up Highlander is because this month I'm doing a lot to debunk and then also demystify these errors around what has been termed by Cornel West as a Santa Clausification process, whether it's of King, whose birthday that we just celebrated lightly, and whether you have issues with the statue in Boston. More so, I have critiques around how it is that he's been crystallized and really arrested at a particular point that we don't necessarily understand King. But in addition to King, I argue that we don't understand the role out of which political education and studies of critical thought in the Black intellectual tradition actually did to provide someone like Rosa Parks her groundings. So I begin with Parks in terms of talking about the role of Black studies and Black student radicalism as a particular legacy out of which we ground ourselves, because her sitting down, Ms. Parks, was not based on fatigue, not an old woman in her early 40s at the time. I bring it up simply to state that her training comes out of Highlander. So whether it was through Ella Baker or Septima Clark, but most importantly of E.D. Nixon, who was not only a Pullman Porter in the tradition of A. Philip Randolph, but E.D. Nixon was also grounded within a tradition of communal or socialist activity. Check out Robin D.G. Kelly's Hammer and Hoe, talking about the deep tradition of the Communist Party within Alabama, out of which the groundings for PE or political education or organizing are actually steeped for the Montgomery Improvement Association. However, Parks, like King, like other radical activists of the era, were informed and instructed around not only nonviolent direct action, but politicized in such a way that her sitting down was inevitably the spark for the powder keg that provides us with what it is that we term the modern day Black freedom movement, the civil rights movement. But some would even go back a year earlier, just talking about the role of Emmett Till and the courageous act of his mother, Mamie Till, to have his photograph pictured globally. But with Parks, her first phone call after she was arrested was not to her husband, it was to Nixon. And thus this began the organizing for the MIA, in which you had over a year of boycotting to break the economic back of Montgomery, and also white supremacy in this particular area. It was not done to spontaneity. It was done through strategizing. So I begin with Parks, and in the spirit of Carter G. Wood, I state that first and foremost, the foundation of Black studies is Black political radicalism. And I'll take it a step further. Black political radicalism steeped in grassroots activism for the motivation of being able to provide PE for grassroots organizing and mobilization efforts. So in parks, not only do you see strategy, but you see what it is that PE or political education steeped in what it is that we identify now as critical Black studies as a legacy that was not for any institution, not for credit hour production, not for the purposes of someone gaining a degree, but someone actually trying to exist and push back against all things that either eliminate Black life, exploit the Black body, or hope to neutralize the existence based on the Negro question that was posed at the Mohawk conference about what it is that we do with the Negro. So Black studies exists within that particular legacy. And next, I want to talk about a figure who also, I would argue, has been mystified. So a part of the demystification I actually want to bring about is someone who I think would be a great example in terms of looking at as a muse for Black studies, but not only as a muse talking about transformational life can become integrated to the stages. So we look at Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. So in his life, you could possibly demarcate stages into either 4 or 5 stages. Malcolm as a school leader, or leader activist, gangster lifestyle, or lumpen. Number 3, prison leader, national spokesman, stage 4 for the Nation of Islam, in which he joined in 1952, in the 1963 for beginning his own organization. And then you have the last stage, which places Malcolm as an internationalist Pan-African leader who I would even argue had the ability or possessed the ability to not only establish policy, but to affect policy globally by mere presence, action, or we'll just say activism. But I point to Malcolm as it relates to Black studies essentially because his transformation begins at a time in which he literally is reverting back to or sees self based on being told what it is that he could not do from what is identified as the Ostrovsky movement. In the 7th grade, he wanted to become a lawyer. And he was told that it's not a profession or an occupation that he should strive toward because it wouldn't be successful or his people wouldn't hire him. So that he reverts and literally rebels and becomes a street individual, which eventually lands him in prison. Now, the period is important because for him, he not only wanted to have a mastery or control of a language, he wanted to be able to engage in thought and critically engage in thought in debate in such a way that would allow him to not only have control over space, but also be able to exact, or I would say arrest the presence of those persons who were in attendance for the debates. And in addition to that, in prison, Malcolm developed skills as a journalist. He later becomes even more enamored with photography in addition to journalism. But this period of Malcolm at the prison, beginning within the Nation of Islam in 1952, where study becomes most important, is that as a minister for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm wanted to not only fish or recruit, but once those recruits were actually converted into the NOI, Malcolm established ministers' training classes. And one quote in particular that sticks out is when a journalist from Europe, from London, called, and he asked Malcolm what his alma mater was. And Malcolm, with a grin, he offered a slight quip. He said, "Oh, my alma mater is books." So I say that because he was a voracious reader, and that the grounding of Malcolm with respect to being an intellectual within a tradition of Black study is that he engaged in critical literacy. And as a part of his minister's training class, he mandated that those who were in attendance not only read all local news organs, but also international news organs as well, the London Times, Peking Review, etc. So he wanted to engage not only the audience, but those who he was training to understand that there was a local, global / transnational, but global element, and also relationship to the role of study that you could find in periodicals, and also how to be able to establish critical thought and use dialectical approaches for juxtaposition based on information that you receive to put info in put information in conversation with different periodicals in order to be able to tease out what the truth was or what factual information needed to be reconsidered. That's the basis of Black study in this essence. And from that tradition, you also get the role of radical book journals, such as the SNCC newsletter, or I would say book journals and news organs, SNCC newsletter, later the Black Panther Party Intercommunal News Service, one of my favorites, actually, of which many periodicals from 1955 moving forward were modeled or framed after, which is Muhammad Speaks of the Nation of Islam. And then you have one of my favorites, the Negro Digest, which by 68, 69 later became the Black World, which is a major publication, which begged the question with respect to the Black scholar, how is it that we engage or identify the Black scholar, and what is the role of the Black scholar with respect to Black studies? So is the Black scholar simply just a scholar or Negro / Black intellectual, or does the Black scholar hope to matriculate or advance to different stages to become the activist scholar? Or in addition to the activist scholar, the warrior / revolutionary scholar, for the purposes of being able to ensure that your contribution and resources are about a liberatory practice that are now contextualized for something beyond and greater than yourself in a communal tradition. So when that Black studies becomes not only a project, but it becomes a particular way of life in which young people, in addition to activists and organizers, can be able to utilize the study as a grounding tool to build think tanks, and then one of my favorites, to be able to organize politically. So let's take SNCC within the tradition, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that was founded February 1st, 1960. April of 1960, after February 1st, Woolworth's sit-in by the Greensboro students. So Ms. Ella Baker, who was able to get funding as an underwritten grant from the SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was able to hold the first SNCC gathering at Shaw University. Now, with SNCC, I think it's important because as broad of a political trajectory in break shifts, advancements, international presence that SNCC was able to capture during the lifeline of the organization. The first two halves, or the first half, in which the two parts, what I would identify as part nonviolent direct action, in addition to sit-in, stand, freedom rides. At some time you get to 65, SNCC develops a Black Power project that's steeped in the South, but you can find in Atlanta, and then most notably with the MFDP, or the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that was unsuccessful at seating 2 delegates in Atlantic City. But then after Mississippi, after they identified the next project spot, which would have been Lowndes County, which now developed the Lowndes County Freedom Organization for the symbol that we get, that is most notably attached to Oakland, California, but is really born out of Atlanta in addition to Mississippi. I'll say Atlanta because the logo, or the symbol for the Black Panther Party, actually comes from the Clark Atlanta University mascot, which is the panther, which was then adopted but made Black for the purpose of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. The basis of the LCFO, or what many folks, and I would say what most people would identify as the Black Panther Party, but the Lowndes County Freedom Organization was able to organize around political registration and the vote, in terms of getting those persons who were most qualified in order to take over tax collector positions, sheriff, comptroller, etc., different things that were available to a Black belt space within Alabama through PE, or education, literally Black study. So what is it that we're able to study politically, in addition to not only the geopolitical aspect, but then political economy aspect of Lowndes County, but most importantly, how it is that Black life and the Black body who were responsible for the literal economic fuel stream of Alabama, able to capitalize, but most importantly, benefit from their presence politically. They did it through study. And how did they begin that process? Essentially by using cartoons. Given that the literacy rate was as low as it was in that particular area, then they literally differentiated their instruction in order to use visuals in addition to text to train and organize and build cadre. So these are the earliest stages, and also some of the tactics that we use for the earliest, I would say, some of the more grounded strategizing modalities for Black studies. So SNCC's final phase, which can arguably be between 66, 67, and about 1971, you have an uptick of not only their radicalism, whether it was through challenging the Vietnam War with one of the famous slogans, "Hell no, we won't go," or you have SNCC being aligned with third world liberation movements, whether it's in Africa and Cuba, South America, etc., or SNCC becoming involved with what I consider to be kind of like the second wave of Black power through Black study, is that the training of cadre, whether it was Charlie Cobb, whether it was Ivanhoe Donaldson, or whether it was James Garrett, whether it was Cleveland Sellers, these persons who are evolving out of SNCC then move to the next phase, or the second wave, as Peniel Joseph or Manning Marable would term it, of Black power, which is extremely important with respect to the legacy of Black studies, for the simple reason that cadre that are being built and that had been developing since the early 1960s through study, whether it was to learn about liberation movements in Africa, or whether it was to become more involved or aware of the role of the vote and the role of building cadre and constituency throughout the U.S. for the purposes of being able to capture and take advantage of Black presence in Black space, or just for the study through think tanks, through journals, etc. SNCC and those persons who were responsible, whether it was through the Revolutionary Action Movement, or whether it was through the evolution of persons who wanted to gain a political united front, such as in Gary for 1972, study became the basis. How so, you may ask? Well, essentially, by 1966-67, because you have a challenge against hegemony within the institutional basis of higher education, and the curriculum are constantly being critiqued, but then also in pushed back against as relates to what it is being taught. These persons are not only taking over administrative buildings with 12 points around how it is that Blackness can be more thoroughly inserted and integrated within in these institutions, but community organizations, whether they were the Young Lords, whether they were the Black Panther Party in Chicago, whether it was Black Peace Stone Nation or the Black Stone Rangers, who later become politicized, you see through the movement, in addition to the activity with Dr. King. These organizations, in addition to those who are finding themselves at these college spaces as students, are now demanding that they move from the position of just being seen within Black space, now being able to control and have self-determinative action within the curriculum and challenge hegemony through the development of what it is that we identify contemporarily as the birth of the Black Studies movement by 1969. So you have students / youth, in addition to the integration or the push for the integration within campus spaces for not just Black presence, but an involvement as it relates to the curriculum to be able to shift it from a dominant cultural society perspective. And now you have the role of what it is identified as the IBI movement, which is the Independent Black Institutional Movement, which is under the umbrella of the Council for Independent Black Institutions, or the CB movement. Because essentially a few things happen. You have a split or a divide by 1968, 1969, in which the radicals, the activists, the students, the scholar activists are demanding a Black university. However, they don't get one Black university, they get Black universities, and not under the auspices of any accredited body by state or national jurisdiction, but they're establishing the CBs or the IBIs for the purposes of being able to train politically, invoke the spirit of what it is that we see, whether it's through Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Jope, or Kick Out the GOP or Jope, John Henrik Clark, Joseph Benyakin and Chancellor Williams, etc. These persons are now saying we'll train our own. Or as the old folks will say, I would hear when I was a young guy, if they didn't treat you right, what would make you think they would be able to teach you right? So thus you get a movement of IBIs, of independent Black institutions, that are calling for the Black university and are now developing in such a way that you not only get one, and I repeat, you get several. So my major work, and I've spoken to on several occasions for Malcolm X Liberation University, that the freedom movement or protest movement now emerges in Durham and then Greensboro, North Carolina. Chicago, where I'm from, you have the University School. Dr. Dixon spoke to me being a graduate of the Center for Inner City Studies. Actually, a parallel think tank / non-traditional and orthodox institution that was built out of Chicago student freedom movement in 1969 was the Community, from which young people actually developed cadre, or cadre was developed, and that cadre was able to organize and identify professors in order to form an alternative schooling situation in order to provide what it is that local institutions of higher ed within the Chicago area were either unwilling or unable to offer. So the birth. In places like Atlanta, you have the Pan-African Work Skills Center. One of my favorites out of the East organization, you had Les Campbell, formerly now an ancestor, or J2A Usi, who was the head of the East organization, had the Uhuru Sasa Shule. Maulana Karenga, with the Ost organization, had the Simba Wachunga. You had the Black Panther schools. You had the Chad School out of Milwaukee. So what I'm providing is that institution only runs for purposes of development and also education for strategy, but it also runs hand in hand with what it is that we get now contemporarily as Black studies. So as alternative forms, you also had a fight that took place on campus as well. Now, the twist is that as Black studies enter into campus spaces, then you have more control based on credit hour production in terms of being able to either provide a degree or provide credits by driving the attendance within school spaces based on who's either eligible, able, or interested in being able to take the classes. However, Black studies from its inception was not thought to be something that could be relegated to a physical space or any one or several institutions, but was thought of as a general political project that would be ongoing as you would reflect upon continuum in education or educational opportunities to be able to access, as I mentioned before, in order to train people to build cadre or constituency for a vote. That was the basis of Black studies. Now, one interesting thing that I've always found in terms of the development of Black studies is that after the death of King, after the death of his assassination, is that not only do you have an uptick in radicalism, you have an increase for the call for Black studies, but independent think tanks, and you also have Black youth who are politicized based on reading. And what are they reading? They're reading one of my favorites. That was also a book that was almost a part of every curriculum within the Center for Inner City Studies and the University of Chicago, which is Harold Cruz's Crisis of an Negro Intellectual. You also had young people who were reading the Red Book. You had Capital, that was a major part of the curriculum for street organizations, in addition to alternative institutions, such as the Institute of the Black World that was founded in Atlanta through Vincent Harding and many other faculty that were coming out of the AUC, or Atlanta University Center Consortium faculty. You had Malcolm X that taught heavy respect to African movements. Nkrumah, my favorite, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and also Groundings with My Brothers. These literally became the curriculum development aspects of what it is that we contemporarily hold to Black studies. And in that tradition, I can say being able to transform youth not only made them more provocative and equipped for the purpose of being able to not only challenge power differentials, but also question with criticism that was politically in alignment with their organizational aims and objectives, whether it was the Student Organization for Black Unity in Greensboro, or whether we're talking about how the Black Panther Party leaders nationally became politicized through studying think tanks. The transformation based on what it is that persons were reading went lockstep or hand in hand with how it is that they foresaw not only their own lives formulating through organizational activity, but then also how they wanted to strategize in order to challenge power in political systems, whether it was in higher education or whether it was for the purposes of being able to install and elect their own representatives for local, state, and national government. So I'm going to close out by just mentioning that of the Black the literal aim to challenge and struggle. So when King is killed in 68, you have an uptick in campus rebellions. And I think I would do in the legacy and history of Black studies would be underserved if there wasn't more mention to talking about the presence of how Black youth / students oscillated between campus spaces, community spaces, and political spaces based on how they're being politicized in order to ensure that their activism, grassroots mobilizing efforts were not germane and relegated to one space. However, being able to diversify their presence in such a way that not only are they pushing back and challenging white supremacy and dominant cultural hegemony within higher ed, but then are also organizing for activities such as the Gary Conference or political convention in 1972, or one of my favorites for African Liberation Day from 1972 all the way to 1977, in which cadre is being built and political education is being built. And then the understandings that what takes place in South Africa is also germane to, relevant, and affecting what takes place in South Carolina, Chicago, Gary, Philadelphia, New York, Watts, Oakland as well. So the Black internationalist perspective and how it is that the groundings of PE literally are the foundation to what it is contemporarily that we hold true to in Black studies. So I'm going to stop my talk there, and I don't know if we're going to have Q&A or if there's going to be just a closeout for that segment, but I'm going to stop it there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benson from the University of Pittsburgh. Next, we'll have student panels. Today, we welcome student presenters. First, we'll have the pleasure to listen to Ms. Athalia Jimenez-Stedman on dismantling the hegemonic patriarchy, hair discrimination against Black women.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me all right. Today, thank you for the introduction. My name is Athalia Jimenez-Stedman, and today I will be challenging the hegemonic patriarchy by discussing the hair discrimination Black women face on a daily basis, focusing primarily on workplaces and professional environments. So this is just a quick outline of what we're going to be discussing today. I'm not going to go over each bullet point, but I will let you read them over just for a second. Okay, I hope that was enough time to read all of that over. Menticide, a systemic and intentional undermining of a person's conscious mind, brainwashing, Merriam-Webster. Now, this is exactly what we see being done to Black women, not only in the United States, but also all over the world. It's a coin termed by Bobby E. Wright, and we can see Black women falling victim to this brainwashing and thus feeling bad or guilty for going to work in natural, cultural, and protective hairstyles. Not only that, but also using relaxers in order to maintain straight hairstyles. These relaxers are now being said to cause early cancer in these women. This is menticide at work. I decided to research this topic. To put it simply, we must protect Black women. Black women had a really big influence on my childhood development as a child, like early childhood. I have a lot of Black women in my family, and I believe Black women are one of the most discriminated against groups in the United States. As a woman, it will always be my duty to stand with my fellow women and do whatever necessary to ensure their rights will not be violated, especially by years of systemic racism and sexism, because I'm a womanist the way Alice Walker taught me to be. Due to European beauty standards, Black women have been forced to damage their hair in order to meet them. Many Black women have experienced discrimination in the workplace and professional environments due to unprofessional hairstyles. This problem stems from both racism and sexism, but is seldom discussed or even acknowledged, especially since Black women have allowed themselves to feel empowered from their hair after centuries of this discrimination. And this image here on the screen is just from 2014, where twists, even pulled back into a ponytail, was not an authorized style for the Army, and you can see how they specifically use Black women in most of their examples for what is not allowed. So, as Dr. Dixon has taught for many years, grounded theory looks to provide a better explanation or theory behind the events. I chose this methodological approach because I have a clear theory as to why these women are being treated this way, and it connects to my topic because I can read the interviews as well as look at other documents of past incidences for references and patterns. Since starting this research in 2019, much more evidence has come forward. This isn't to say that it wasn't always there, it just means the conversation has become better, well known, and this is still very much a work in progress, not only for me, but for the country and the fight for ending this discrimination. My theoretical perspective is the standpoint theory, which focuses on highlighting and amplifying the voices of those who are most marginalized and discriminated against. We know the discrimination of Black people's hair goes all the way back to the enslavement of Africans and Black people. However, moving forward in a society, Black people are still considered inferior to white people, and women are considered inferior to men. This resulted in Black women being discriminated against more than a white woman or a Black man. Now, this is not to diminish the traumas that Black men also go through. However, it is important to note that one of the beauty standards for women is long hair, whereas for men, it is short hair. And in this research, I am discussing only Black women. So these are my research questions. Why are Black women still continuously discriminated against in workplaces and professional environments for their natural and/or protective hairstyles across America? And do women face this kind of discrimination more? These are the questions that my research specifically highlights and what we're going to be discussing today. So for my data collection, I am able to use stories and instances of women facing discrimination for their non-Eurocentric hairstyles. I used the Black is Beautiful movement, and the first article that I was able to find in 2019 on this topic was Hey Girl, Am I More Than My Hair? African American Women and Their Struggles with Beauty, Body Image, and Hair by Tracy Owens Patton, who is actually a professor at the University of Wyoming, and I didn't know that when I first started my research. So these are my findings. The Black is Beautiful movement really takes off in the 1960s by Black people and African Americans, and then later spreads. It has its roots in the movement from the 1930s that argued the importance of Pan-African racial identity across the world. This was made in order to fight Eurocentric ideals that Black people and their culture are less desirable and unattractive. So, in 2013, Chastity Jones had a company hire her and later rescind their offer because she refused to change her hairstyle from locks. In 2018, an elementary school girl got sent home because of her braided hairstyle. And in 2019, Brittany Noble Jones, a former news anchor whose news director said her natural hair was, and I quote, unprofessional and the equivalent of him throwing on a baseball cap to go to the grocery store. Now, these are just a few women and girls who have faced these repercussions for simply wearing the hair that they are born with. Now, imagine how traumatizing that can be for someone, especially for a young child who sometimes can't even understand why someone would be so hateful about their hair that they were born with. Once again, this is menticide at work. Menticide is going to be a recurring topic throughout this speech, so just always keep that definition in the back of your mind. For this picture, this is a picture of Brittany Noble Jones, the woman we talked about in the last slide. On the left, you can see that that's her hair straightened and what she would usually wear to work And then on the right is what she says is the reason that she lost her job. As time has progressed, more rights have been given to oppressed groups, but because these groups are still being treated differently, it often pits them against each other, causing the oppressed oppressing the oppressed. Black people are looked at as inferior to white people, and women are looked at as inferior to men. Put these both together, and it puts Black women at the worst place to be, which is why this research must also be looked at from a womanist point of view, since early feminism was not created to represent Black women. Not only are they discriminated against for the color of their skin, but they're also discriminated against by Black men for being women. While coiled, kinky hair is grown by both Black men and women will face more discrimination in workplaces and professional environments. It is well known women experience more sexual harassment and unequal salaries compared to men simply for being women. That is why it is so easy for Black women to experience such discrimination. While conducting this research, I read an article called Melanin and Curls, Evolution of Black Women Candidates. And this article focused primarily on the way Black candidates are seen based off the curliness of their hair and their skin tone, and then as well as the way it directly affects them when it comes to voting. The authors examined two hypotheses, the empowerment hypothesis and the internal discrimination hypothesis, with focus on the second one. While this work is another workplace instance of hair discrimination, it isn't one that I ever considered before stumbling upon this research and this specific article. The discrimination discussed in this article is important because part of it is the way voters see nominees and how it affects them when it comes to voting, especially in Wyoming. Next, I have this short 1-minute video. Hopefully the sound works.
My dad always told me that I should love my hair. So I did.
Wait for me right here for a second. Excuse me, sir. We have a strict hair policy here. I'm afraid I can't let you attend school today.
Even when it wasn't easy.
We talked about this. You can't wear braids if you want to walk at graduation.
Even when no one else did. My dad always told me that I should fight for my hair. So I am.
So the Crown Act stands for creating a respectful and open world for natural hair that the company Dove has helped fund and start. As of today, there are 6 states within the United States of America that have completely refused to acknowledge the Crown Act, including Wyoming. This means that there has been no movement towards legislation, there has been no committee in order to put this forward or anything in that sort, whereas other states have either passed it or have it on the ballot to be voted for. So, what's at stake? The United States of America has a deep history of racism, enslaving people, and the mistreatment of Africans, African Americans, and Black people, which plays one of 2 roles. The other is the history of extreme sexism. Women are very discriminated against as well. It is known that we often experience sexual harassment in the workplace and professional environments with little to nothing being done. Discrimination against a woman's natural hair for being unprofessional is the ultimate way for a white man to show the superiority they believe they have not only over Black people, but Black women. Once again, emphasizing menticide. On top of all of that, expression and strength in hair is very prominent in Black culture everywhere. And even though many women find this empowerment in their hair, there's plenty of women who don't. So that's always important to keep in mind also. There's plenty of women that have held a lot of their identity within their hair and then eventually decide to shave it all off or to cut it all off to be able to find themselves as in a deeper way rather than just letting their hair represent them. So all in all, I want to thank the Black Studies Center for allowing me this opportunity to present my research again. I want to specifically thank Dr. Dixon for being such an inspiration to me and so many others. And as well as Dr. Tracy Owens Patton. Finding her research paper on this topic as my first article really sparked this passion inside of me, and I had the great pleasure of taking some of her courses this semester and last semester. And it was quite the shock to find out that the Dr. Owen Patton's that I was citing in all of my research was the same professor that I was able to learn underneath at the University of Wyoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jimenez Stedman, for presenting your research. Next, we welcome Mr. Emmanuel Pregnon, who will be speaking about dismantling the Willie Lynch letter. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. This is my research, Deconstructing the Willie Lynch Letter. My name is Emmanuel Pregnon, and this is by the Black Studies Center Student Research Conference 2023. Next slide. Okay. Exacting statement. In a system of oppression, an educator is either an oppressor or a revolutionary. Lerone Bennett. Ongoing my research process, I've looked at my research through a revolutionary lens. And to me, what Lerone Bennett means by that quote is that an educator has the ability to either reprogram or reassimilate and free and shed light and life into the oppressed. Next slide. Methodology, case study. My case study will permit a detailed examination of the Willie Lynch letter. Next slide. My theoretical perspective. Just as a tree without its roots is dead, a people without history or cultural roots also becomes a dead people. By Malcolm X. So essentially what this quote means is that people who don't have roots, don't have identity, they don't have a connection to their history, and they don't know who they are. Next slide. So as the role of the researcher, to me, this research is very important and very dear to me because the Willie Lynch letter is a very integral piece to understanding where Black people stand today in contemporary society. Many very contemporary examples. So I'm an African-American studies scholar. I'm a football player for the University of Wyoming. I'm an All-American, and I'm a Black Studies member, Black Studies Center member, and I'm also a young man of purpose. And this is a group that I partook in from my freshman year of high school to senior year of high school. Next slide. Research questions. Overarching question. Did the tactics that Willie Lynch implemented in the breaking process of the Black woman work and are still works today? Sub questions. How will the Black woman continue the same mindset onto her offspring? And how will she raise the next generation of children? Next slide, please. Cardinal principles of making a slave. Lynch developed foolproof methods of keeping and maintaining subservient slaves for 300 years or better. How? Now, I pulled this from the letter and I improvised on it. And essentially, Lynch says 1712, that he developed foolproof methods of keeping and maintaining subservient slaves for 300 years or better. And a key word that I like to pull from the letter is perpetually. And essentially that means that it does not have to be essentially physical, right? It does not have to be some form of physical enforcement or some form of physical enslavement. It can be mental. So next slide. So the how is, how did he do this? It's my findings. He did this through fear, distrust, and envy. These are methods, essentially, devised methods that he created in order to keep Blacks subservient, perpetually subservient for countless years. So fear, when we think of fear, we think of slave auctions. When we think of fear, we think of buck breaking. When we think of fear, we think of the constant rape of Black women on the plantation, babies being stolen, babies used as alligator bait, so on and so forth. When we think of just trust, we think of using other enslaved Africans as overseers to the plantation. When we think of distrust, we also think of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad and how she had to face troubles with people that weren't willing to die for the freedom and the will of their people and the freedom of the cause of freeing Black people as a whole. And when we think of distrust, we think of the role reversal of the Black family structure. When we think of envy, we think of the house Negro versus the field Negro. We think of colorism, light skin versus dark skin. We think of self-hatred, which is essentially an inferiority complex. Next slide. Findings. Lynch had informed and encouraged his counterparts that intelligence, size, sex, size of plantation, and status on plantation were some of the most integral components to keeping Blacks subservient, keeping essentially trying to distill or wipe out any revolts or revolutionary mindsets, essentially. So one thing I want to pinpoint in this quote is sex. And when we think of sex, we have to think of the male versus the female within the Black community. We have to think of the customs associated with the male and female identities, particularly with the Black woman and the roles associated with those identities. Next slide. Findings. Don't forget you must pitch the old Black female versus the young Black female and the young Black male against the old Black male. You must use the dark-skinned slaves versus the light-skinned slaves and the light-skinned slaves versus the dark-skinned slaves. Next slide. Okay. Findings. Breaking process of the African woman. Take the female and run a series of tests on her to see if she will submit to your desires willingly. Test her in every way because she is the most important factor for good economics. So in my research, essentially the way I formulated my research was looking at the breaking process of the African woman and essentially putting myself within the mindset of Willie Lynch, within the mindset of a slave master, right? And everything that he would think of in order to structure his plantation and keep the slaves from revolting and so on and so forth. So this quote essentially means without the Black woman, without her, there is no system because she reproduces and she teaches, and that would continue the cycle of chattel slavery. She acts as the guide and the nurse. Second quote is, if she knows any sign of resistance in submitting completely to your will, do not hesitate to use the bullwhip on her to extract the last bit of resistance out of her. Take care to not kill her, for in doing so, you spoil good economics. So I had to look at this quote essentially through a financial lens because her worth and her wealth lies in her ability to recreate and reproduce. Next slide. So the Black slaves, after receiving this indoctrination, shall carry on and will become self-refueling and self-generating for hundreds of years, maybe thousands. So this was in 1712, and he says self-refueling and self-generating. So that would essentially mean that the methods and the strategic methods that he instilled within these plantations would carry throughout on a generational effect, a generational standpoint. So next slide. So here we have reversed the relationship in her natural uncivilized state. She would have a strong dependency on the uncivilized N-word male, and she would have a limited protective tendency toward her independent male offspring and would raise male offspring to be dependent like her. Now, essentially, this quote means that Lynch is interrupting nature. Lynch is interrupting the study of nature. This is another example of the role reversal with the black male and the black female and the atomic black family structure. Second quote states, when in complete submission, she would train her offspring in the early years to submit to labor when they become of age. So looking at my research through essentially Willie Lynch's eyes, we know that Willie Lynch understands that the black woman is single-handedly the most prized possession to this devised system of oppression and dehumanization of black people as a whole. Next slide. Okay, so what's at stake? Real versus fake. Did Willie Lynch actually exist? It is speculated to believe that Willie Lynch did not actually exist because of factors like the words that he used, the diction, the structures of his speech. Some of the words that he used were used 100 years after his speculated birth, and he was born in Pennsylvania, Virginia. But regardless of his knowing of his existence, I feel as if Willie Lynch did exist figuratively because of the strategies and the methods implemented within the plantations we see on a contemporary example in Black America today. So, explanation of socioeconomic issues in the Black community. What's at stake there is essentially when we look at the Black community today on a contemporary example, we see how fear, distrust, envy, and all these distinctions made between Black people and all these differences made between Black people, pitting them against one another, structuring this hate amongst those that look alike and having different interests through these devised methods. Things arise, things that occur because of that are, unemployment, divorce rates. We could look at gang violence. We could look at red versus blue, incarceration rates, and intergenerational problems. And what I mean by that is the lessons in everything taught from the next generation onto the next generation. Another thing that's at stake is the plight of the Black woman. And essentially, the plight of the Black woman, we can look at essentially her expression through it all, right? We said she's the most prized possession. So we know that we have to understand her feelings. How does she feel? What is her role? What is her role essentially within the Black household? And within the Black household, she acts as both the male and the female within the household on a contemporary example, because the Black male was pulled out of the household. He was essentially castrated and separated from the family, and that essentially destroys the Black family, the atomic Black family structure, when everything is not jointed and structured together. So the existence of the Black family, this I feel like is one of the most important stakes here, only because we have to look at the Black family and what it started from and what it has progressed to become. And we have seen through the methods that Willie Lynch instilled, implemented, and devised and used within these plantations. We have to look at those and see how essentially they disassembled essentially the atomic Black family structure. And some examples I could give is the bull whipping, the raping of Black males in front of the plantation, taking the biggest male on the plantation and using him as an example to the plantation to essentially, show the standard, right? Show who's in power, the sort of hegemony there with, the power structure on the plantation, slave master being at the top, and essentially overall existence of the Black family. Will there be a Black family in the future? And I feel like that's almost very uncertain at this moment in time. I also feel as if when we look at the existence of the Black family, we see on a contemporary example, Black households are filled with single parent homes. And when we see that, we see Section 8, we see the destruction of Black people as a whole, and many problems that come from problems that are already existing that spark other problems. So another example I can give for the plight of the Black woman is her isolation and all, and where she stands through this role reversal, and essentially what this role reversal is causing on a contemporary example. It's causing essentially most Black people to be independent and not look for, any structure within their community as a whole to work together and things of that nature. So that is my presentation. I want to thank Dr. Dixon for allowing me this chance to get to present to y'all. I want to thank the Black Studies Center. I want to also thank YMOP as well, Rico Went. And thank you all. That is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pregnon. Next, we welcome Ms. Katherine Chambers, presenting on the transgender activism of the gay rights movement, a history of exclusion, forgotten events, and significant figures.
Hi, I'm just going to get my slides up real quick and then I'll start talking. Awesome. I'm hoping everyone can see this. So I'm just going to put it in present mode and then we should be good to go. So today, like they said, I'm going to be talking about the transgender activism of the gay rights movement, a history of exclusion, forgotten events, and significant figures. So I want to start off with this quote from Leslie Feinberg. She was a stone butch lesbian in the 1990s, prominently for her academics, but she did a lot of work for like transgender activism as well as looking at like non-binary people. And I feel like her argument sums up mine better than most. She said that many of us have come to think of the 1969 Stonewall Rebellion as the birth of the lesbian and gay liberation movement. But in fact, the first historic wave of gay liberation from 1869 to 1935 began in Germany. So I felt like this was really important because when I was starting my research, I felt like no one agreed with me. There was very little archive work I could do. But like finding Feinberg's work and then finding Stryker's on top of that, it was kind of like a complete game changer for me. So within this presentation, I have a few topics that I have to go through, considering like my role as a researcher and why that was really important to acknowledge in my paper. Then taking you through like how I decided to conduct my paper, so looking at methodology, theoretical perspective, and the research questions. And then looking at my findings and kind of figuring out what I got from my research and like where I'm looking next. So as my role as a researcher, in the corner here, you can see me at the Rzeszut Museum in Berlin, which was part of my research last term, which was really fun. And I got to look at a lot of archive stuff from Hirschfeld himself. Really, the reason that I began to look at this is I'm part of the LGBT community, not necessarily transgender, but like it's always interested me. and I was never taught it at school. And I started looking at Marsha P. Johnson at first, who was a very prominent transsexual woman during the 1980s. But her involvement was one of the very few people I could find. And I wanted to find out like why Stonewall was considered like so prominent compared to other things. So for my methodology, because I was looking at a community, person, and event all together, the case study methodology was just absolutely perfect for me because I could use a variety of data sources like interviews, secondary material, but most importantly, primary material, because it was very hard to find people's experiences described by themselves. And that was one thing I wanted to point out in my research, that stories should be told from both their perspective and others' perspective, which was really important to bring up in like being my role as a researcher, because I felt like even though I wasn't in the transgender community, I had a perspective, but I also had to consider other perspectives that weren't my own. So for my dominant like narrative section, I looked at how transgender activism was limited to 1969 Stonewall riots and kind of beyond that, because it very much was excluding so many people that worked before that period. And there was a lot of progression. Obviously, it was still very discriminatory, and it is still this day. But I found things like the Compton's Cafeteria riot and Magnus Hirschfeld, who were doing really important work, but yet they don't quite get the same recognition. And I've got a great quote here from Susan Stryker talking about homonormativity, which she said was the double sense of marginalization and displacement. So what this kind of means is that transgender people not only get discriminated between, like by non-queer people, but also by queer people, and like how their stories can almost be like sidetracked to the gay liberation front rather than their own story. So for my research questions, I was looking at to what extent it can be argued that the transgender rights movement began before 1969. And I was focusing on Magnus Hirschfeld, Christine Jorgensen, and the 1966 Compton's Cafeteria riot. So I've got like a little timeline for you here to see. So it starts in 1910, but like some of the facts that I found will refer to before that because Hirschfeld was born in 1868. But that was the first mention of the word transvestite, which in the 1990s became the word transgender. So it was very kind of like a landmark event. And then my period ended around 1967 with Christine Jorgensen's personal autobiography being published. So first on my list, I chose to look at Magnus Hirschfeld. I didn't know anything about him. I wasn't taught about him in school. But when I began to look into the terminology of the word transgender, everything led back to Hirschfeld. So he was born in 1868, like I said, and he was a German physician who basically he set up an Institute for Sexual Sciences in Berlin, which was to help people get the treatment that they needed. So like affirm their gender, but also providing them a safe space when homosexuality and cross-dressing was still illegal. At the time, like he was always trying to find ways to make sure that people felt more included than they had been like legally, which included creating the transvestite chain, which was transvestite passes. So basically it'd be kind of like a driver's license where you get a piece of paper that said, like, this person's allowed to dress in these clothing. It's like part of a research study, which obviously was quite limiting language. It was kind of making it into a mental disorder, but for them to be able to go out in public as they were was like quite impressive for the time. So people really appreciated that. But unfortunately in the 1930s, due to the rise of the Nazi Party and the idea of sterilization and things like that, his institute was burnt down and they burnt down like most of his books. So it's been really difficult to try and access all that great work that he did because so much of it was lost. And he died in exile in 1935, but which one of his lovers claimed was sort of heartbreak because just all of his research was gone. But like it demonstrated that work could be done and it could have been done like as early as it was. Another person I looked at was Christine Jorgensen. She was one of the first women who publicly transitioned in the US media. But it wasn't anything expected. It was kind of, she went to Denmark to get the procedure done. She was from quite an affluent background. She had family in Denmark. So she had like this ability to go over there and get the surgery that she needed and the hormone treatment that she needed. But when she came back, the story had been leaked to the New York Times, who did the cover of calling her the Blonde Beauty. This made her like very prominent in the public eye. She was critiqued for everything that she did, from her like gender reconstruction surgery to how she presented. Fortunately for Jorgensen, she was very feminine presenting. She really enjoyed being very womanly. She was very domesticated. She went into acting and singing, which were kind of like accepted roles for women at the time. But the issue is because they made this ideal of what a transgender woman could be, many others suffered from like backlash because they had this idea of like, well, if you're going to be this woman, then you have to be like the pinnacle of womanhood and innocence. But some women just wanted to like live their own existence and they didn't want to conform to those same kind of like gender roles. But it was also good that she had that platform to be like, this happens. This is her truth and what she wanted to do with her life. So the 1966 Compton's Cafeteria riot started in the Tenderloin district in San Francisco, and is one of my main points of contention with my research because it is very similar to the 1969 Stonewall riots, but it's not taught in any curriculum that I've found, and there's not actually a lot of documentation about it. Basically, it kind of started out because there was a lot of police corruption in the area, and police were harassing trans women and drag queens and things like that. And they just couldn't, it got to a breaking point where they were starting to gentrify the area, which meant even more like incarceration. And they just decided that like, enough's enough, we're going to have a riot. And even though it was very small scale, like for the local area, it was really big. Like Vanguard was set up, which was a zine about queer issues, as well as like the Center for Special Problems, which basically allowed people to get gender affirming care without having to pay the extortionate amount or going into weird medical trials that may or may not help them, which was incredibly important. So why is Stonewall considered more important? So Stonewall might be more established because of its location. I found a big controversy between East and West Coast because New York is so well known around both the US and the world. It has a great widespread publication circuit. So anything, news stories that kind of happened in New York Times would be then transferred around the world and like read about from, say, Russia to the UK. But it was definitely one of those things where population and publicity were like two very big important things. At Stonewall, there was maybe 200 people on the streets, whereas at Compton's Cafeteria riot, there was maybe about 20. So it's kind of, they're making small waves, but those waves shouldn't be ignored. And also as well for Jorgensen and not considering other women, it was definitely due to her race and her class. She was like a very affluent white woman who had access to money to be able to do those things. And she didn't have to resort to sex work, which is one of like the most prominent ways of employment, just due like gender discrimination and race discrimination or whatever. But it was kind of a very important thing to sit there and go, oh, okay, like these things happened and they're like really important to consider that they have happened. So what's at stake? Realistically, you might be wondering at this point, like, yes, of course, all these things happened and yes, they should be recognized. But what's so important about recognizing that? Well, it's a repeated belief in the transgender community that you cannot be what you cannot see. People fear the unknown. In the last 10 years, there have been 256 cases of known violence against the transgender and gender non-conforming community in 37 states since 2013. These are the known deaths. Violence is a threat that every day the transgender community has to face. By acknowledging their history, we're acknowledging the discrimination that continues to exist. If we can see what we can see, then we can understand and we can learn from that and create movement and create more activism based on these women who came before us. So I'm asking you to imagine a classroom full of young students learning about transgender activists like Magnus Hirschfeld and Laverne Cox and Eliza Newton, and potentially seeing themselves for the first time. And yeah, that is pretty much everything I wanted to say. I just wanted to thank Professor Dixon for allowing me to present again this year. It's really great to have that international connection now that I'm back in the UK. But like doing my exchange year and being able to work on that was just amazing. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Stryker for all her help that she gave me. At Mills College. She is so busy in her field doing so many different projects, and she was so reassuring to me that like I was on the right track and that I was doing everything right, and just to keep researching really. And also to my family and friends who have listened to me talk about this a lot for a year and a half. So you're welcome, and I'm sorry at the same time. But yeah, thank you so much for everything. I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chambers, and thank you for finding the time to present from the UK. Ms. Shifa Ijaz will now present a reflection on patriarchy and its correspondence with capitalism and the God of Small Things.
Thank you, Maya. Well, before I start, I would like to thank Mr. Frederick Dixon for helping me in this research and also asking me to present this. The topic of my research is a reflection on patriarchy and its correspondence with capitalism in the God of Small Things. Before I go further into this, I would like to read an excerpt from the book itself. The twins were too young to know that these were only history's henchmen, sent to square the books and collect the dues from those who broke its laws, impelled by feelings that were primal yet paradoxically wholly impersonal, feelings of contempt born of inchoate, unacknowledged fear, civilization's fear of nature, men's fear of women, power's fear of powerlessness, man's subliminal urge to destroy what he could neither subdue nor defy. And I think what can be seen through this excerpt is the reason I chose this book for my research. There is a brief overview that I would discuss in this presentation as the title, methodology, the theoretical perspective, research questions, role of the researcher, findings, and what is at stakes. Well, before I go further, I would like to discuss how I got to select the title of my research, and I think I was very clear on what I was going to do, what I was interested in, and that was patriarchy, but not as a separate and independent element, but its correspondence with capitalism and how its dynamics work. With its interconnections with capitalism, but as a literature student, I wanted something from a fiction writing that would allow me to do what I wanted to do with this research. I think the first time I read Arundhati Roy, the first thing that grabbed my attention was her ability to shed light on the plight of oppression from the lens of working class women, and she highlights patriarchy in a way that it makes us see through the lens of those who are at the lowest level in social hierarchy. And I think that is what allowed, because she doesn't allow us to simplify what is complicated. I think this is what made me select this book for my presentation. And because I was working on a story, I required a methodology that would allow me to interpret and analyze my research, and it allows me to analyze the particular issues that I wanted to talk about through the events of the book itself. And that is the reason I think I chose the narrative methodological approach. I was indeed in conflict that maybe I should go for case study. And I remember that I talked to Dr. Frederick about it also, that whether I should go for the narrative method or the case study. But the reason that I chose this method was that it allowed me to analyze the story, to expose the correspondence of capitalism and patriarchy, and allowed me and to present my own analysis of the particular issues. Capitalism not only provided structural strength to patriarchy, but interlocked itself with it to achieve its goals, which crushed the permanent underclass. When I saw it, and when how I see it from the perspective of global South, I cannot in any way separate these two issues. I cannot separate the issue of patriarchy from capitalism. I think that it is very important to understand that in our work towards the liberation of women, we need to understand how capitalism is playing its role in upholding the system. And it is not accidental, it is not incidental, it is by deliberate choice, and they do it in a way to sustain the status quo of the ruling regime. I think it was, for me, it was a responsibility on me to see this issue in an interdependent way. Uh, and I think that is the reason I chose the issue of patriarchy with its correspondence with capitalism. And that is also the reason that I think that these two issues must be investigated together. They must be interpreted together. And I think that is how we can go towards the question of how can we liberate women in its true sense, and how can we put a narrative that would understand the true emancipation of women would not be possible if we do not understand its link with the system of capitalism. And I think in the book itself, I find it amazing and I find it brilliant that how Arundhati Roy puts her characters in a web where multiple systems of exploitation are working on her characters, and she doesn't feel the urge to simplify that. She exposes it in a very subtle way. I remember for my research questions, I was very confused, not confused, but I had to do a lot of work in rephrasing it by cutting some things and rewriting certain things, because I wanted them to show the crux of the issue I was going to talk in my research. So the overarching question was, to what extent do capitalism and patriarchy influence the permanent underclass? And the sub-question was, in what ways does the correspondence between capitalism and patriarchy help maintain the status quo of the ruling regime? I think why I focused in particular to the correspondence between capitalism and patriarchy was the reason that I wanted to show how it is helping in maintaining the status quo of the ruling regime. I think we can, in order to explain the other, we must explain the first part, that whether the correspondence exists or not. I think it is often deliberately removed from the mainstream narrative that there is a correspondence between capitalism and patriarchy. And for this reason, I wanted to put this into my sub-question, that not only the correspondence exists, but it also and it exists for a reason, and that reason is to help maintain the status quo of a particular class. Well, my role from being a woman from Global South, I mainly focused on questioning the narrative that patriarchy and capitalism are disconnected. I did not believe in that, and it kind of made me feel like this is a way to alienate women, and this is a way to shift their focus from how they can truly liberate themselves. But when I was going through my own research again, I was thinking of where do we go from here now? If I have questioned the narrative that it is not disconnected, and it is indeed working in its connection with each other, and capitalism does support it and perpetuates it, then what do we do next? So I think it opens further research paths, and there are certain questions that if that exists, then how are we going to deal with it, and how are we going to show our resistance towards it? How are we going to resist it? So I think that for many writers, it would open further research paths from the Global South. And it is written for the effort of transforming pedagogy into resistance. When I was working on the research, I did not want it to be an academic work. And when I say that, I want to say that the essence of doing this work was not to limit itself into the academic, only into academia. I want this, that if it is truly a good work, then it must be transformed into practical resistance. And I think that any work that I would go on to do further on this research would be from the focus on how can I do this in order for people to understand that we must understand in order to stand in solidarity with each other to dismantle their power onto ourselves. Well, the findings were permanent underclass is subjugated to face the worst forms of oppression. Women belonging to such a class are the most at-risk population. Patriarchy not merely exists but feeds and strengthens itself in a capitalist society. It finds its justification in the flexibility of capitalism. And when I say that, it means that oftentimes I hear this narrative that, and I've heard it a lot many times, that if capitalism works good, then the problem would be solved. It is not working well. For me, if you have to understand the reality of how brutal the system of capitalism, then you will have to look at the plight of the third world countries. And it's not to say that capitalism is not working badly there. It's a way to say that capitalism is working under a very thick farce. It is working in the first world countries, and I think that is the reason it saves itself in the flexibility of itself. It saves itself. But I used to think that maybe if we make certain changes in the system of capitalism, then that would work. But I think that the permanent underclass is made deliberately in this system so that they can be subjugated in order for the profit of a certain ruling class. And I think Arundhati Roy, in the characterization of her characters, she makes a brilliant point when she develops a narrative in which her characters, when they are thrown from the social setup to the political setup, when the character of Ammu is assaulted outside, and then she goes to the police and she gets assaulted there again. But in the law, it is said that you cannot assault women. And in the law, it is said that you must protect women, but that protection does not exist because you don't care about these women. I think that Arundhati Roy's brilliance of showing how women are not protected, the most at risk women are not protected either in the social setup and also in the political setup. She makes a brilliant point that she suffers from both ways. What's at stakes? With the emergence of private property and the capitalistic modes of production, patriarchy, though existed before, became firmly entrenched in society. However, it manifested itself in the worst forms possible in the subcontinent. It continues to exist to date. Its correspondence with capitalism, its horrible effects on women, and its continuous perpetuation make it a relevant issue in our world today. Well, that is all. If there are any questions, you can ask.
Thank you, Ms. Ijaz. I think we all can say that we enjoy listening to these presentations. Next, we welcome Ms. Jade Reinhardt, who will speak on Connecting the Generational Divide, the Legacy of Dr. Leslie B. McLemore and Civil Rights Activism.
Sorry, I'm having some trouble getting my presentation up. Hi, okay. Thank you, Maya, for the introduction. I am Jade Reinhardt. I'm an undergrad student here at the university. And like Maya said, my presentation today is about connecting that generational divide and the legacy of Dr. Leslie Burrell McLemore and civil rights activism. So just to start off with this quote, Freedom Summer was a watershed activity from the standpoint of hoping to bring about some fundamental change in Mississippi and by definition, the rest of the country. It was a seminal of activity in terms of harnessing all the energy of people coming from different places throughout the country and even from foreign countries to participate. Dr. McLemore said this in 2014, and I just think that it is a really good quote to kind of start out my presentation. So for my methodology, so this first started as a capstone essay about the Freedom Summer Project, Freedom Summer Movement. And for that, I decided to go with the phenomenological approach, and that allowed me to focus on conducting interviews, documents, watching videos, visiting places and events, just to understand the meaning of those who participated in the Freedom Summer movement, and it also allowed me to explore experience of a particular community or group or even people. And so that's what I chose for my capstone essay. As for my oral history, which is what I've moved into, that methodological approach, I chose the narrative approach, which allows me to focus on spoken or written words from Dr. McLemore. And it just allowed me to really analyze his story and what all he went through kind of up close. As for my theoretical perspective, I looked at the feminist standpoint theory, which allowed me to look at a marginalized group that are socially situated and make it more possible for people to become more aware of that that group or that person in my case. Yeah. And so kind of my role as the researcher, I started in the spring of 2022 taking Dr. Dixon's Intro to African American History class. And as part of that class, we had to do a capstone essay. And so I decided for my capstone essay to look into the Freedom Summer movement. I had first heard about that while reading the Freedom Summer Murders book. I think I was about an 8th grader when I read that. And that really piqued my interest. But with this capstone essay, I really wanted to look more into what happened in the Freedom Summer movement, what that was really about, and dive deeper into how that took place. And then in the fall of 2022, it turned into an oral history interview. In the spring of 2022, I was introduced to Dr. McLemore through Dr. Dixon to interview him a little bit about his involvement in Freedom Summer movement and what that looked like for him and all those things that he was able to do. And so then in the fall, when I took social justice with Dr. Dixon, we transitioned from just that capstone essay into an oral history interview and project, which would later turn into public history. And then also, just as my role in interviewing Dr. McLemore, I see myself as kind of building that bridge from his experience and those also who experienced it with him into helping people in my generation have that deeper understanding of what it was like for Dr. McLemore, but also those around him. So these are my research questions, my overarching and my sub-question. At first, these were just specifically meant for that capstone essay that I did in my first class with Dr. Dixon, but then they really changed from a focus on Freedom Summer into a focus of the civil rights movement and on someone who participated in it, and how that differs from kind of the mainstream narrative that we hear about the civil rights movement. And then just how the participation of someone in the civil rights movement can change a view on the civil rights movement in general. So for my findings, I conducted 2 interviews with Dr. McLemore. The first interview was on April 21st, 2022. And here I really focused on his involvement in the Freedom Summer movement. I did get a little bit of a background on his involvement in just social movement in general. And that's kind of where this first quote comes into. He talks about how in high school, this first quote talks about how in high school he was a part of student council. And while a part of student council, they had assigned 4 faculty members to oversee that because they really didn't want any demonstrations or anything like that. And Dr. McLemore talks a little bit about how there was nothing in Walls, Mississippi, where he grew up and went to high school at, that they could really demonstrate to integrate or anything like that. And so what they decided to do instead was to hold a boycott of classes. And this boycott really played into the number of faculty members overseeing student council, which were just one too many. And then the lack of African American history books in this school that was just built for African Americans in Walls, but also the cafeteria food and just the quality of that. And so with this boycott of classes, they had kids show up to school, they went to the gym, and they boycotted classes. They didn't go. And so from this, the principal at the high school was able to take away some of the faculty members overseeing student council, but then they were also promised to try and find and get into the school more history books on African Americans. And then also a promise of trying to figure out how to make the cafeteria food better. And so that's from that first interview really is one of the things that he talked a lot about was just his start in social movement and how it started in high school. The next quote that I have here is also from that first interview, and really what that shows is we got a little bit more into the interview, into his role in the Freedom Summer movement. And that first started with the Freedom Vote campaign, which happened the year before, 1963. And with this is a mock election that they held. And Aaron Henry ran for governor in this mock election, and then Reverend Ed King ran for lieutenant governor. And this election was really used to show how, or to kind of counter what elected officials in Mississippi were saying, that African Americans didn't want to vote, that they just had no interest in voting. And with this mock election, 80,000 people came out to vote, and it really countered what was being told to everyone else in Mississippi, but also to the nation, that, African Americans didn't want to vote, and that 80,000 people really, they wanted the vote. If given the chance, they were going to go out and vote, and they were going to go vote for who they wanted. And Dr. McLemore, for this Freedom Vote campaign, was a Northern Mississippi coordinator, and so he went around to several counties, getting people to vote in this mock election, telling people what was going on and why this was happening. And because of this Freedom Vote campaign, it really set the groundwork for the Freedom Summer movement the following summer in 1964. And it showed that, African Americans in Mississippi, they wanted to vote, and they wanted to be able to have a say in their government, whether that was locally, state, or at a national level with the federal government. And this allowed people with the Freedom Summer movement to come down to Mississippi to help African Americans register to vote, and then to even start freedom schools, which were a huge part of the Freedom Summer movement, where African Americans were taught about their own history instead of that what white people were trying to teach. My second interview I conducted with Dr. McLemore was on November 22nd of 2022, so just recently in the fall. And this interview was really more of a look at his early life, whether from his earliest memory up until, him going off to college at Rust College in Mississippi. And so this quote here, I decided to go with because it really shows how Dr. McLemore started his being able to speak in front of people, and where his education came from. He grew up going to the Walls Chapel CME Church, and so at that church he was giving presentations or speeches, and just really honing in on some of those skills that he would later come to use as student body president, in the student council, and then later at Rust College when he joined SNCC and other organizations there. And so this quote really shows that he was able, through the church, to prepare for anything that he did moving forward. His grandmother and his mother really pushed for him and his brother Eugene to give speeches at church and to become involved a lot in the church. And he talked about a lot how his grandmother was the one who would pick out speeches at the church, and she was the one who really made him and his brother Eugene practice those speeches. And it wasn't just looking down at the paper and reading off of it. It was more of you have to memorize this. You've got to be able to not look at the paper and really hone in on those skills that he would later use in life. Then the second quote from my second interview with him, I think is a really kind of powerful one. I had asked the question of what was that first event that connected him to the civil rights movement, that he could remember. And, of course, he talks about the lynching and death of Emmett Till that happened in 1953. But then he talked about Brown versus Board of Education, which was the Supreme Court decision that happened in 1954, and how he talks about remembering discussing with family members while in the cotton field about what schools they were going to go to now that Brown versus Board of Education was passed. And I just think that this shows a lot of what that effect or those two events had an effect on him. And he talked about how the lynching and death of Emmett Till really scared his mother and his grandfather and his family members as he was about 100 miles from where it all took place. And so that was something that he really honed in on as being the reason or his introduction into the civil rights movement. But then he also talked about how what made him very aware of the civil rights movement and civil rights issues in general in the nation was the Montgomery boycotts that Dr. King did. And so he talked a lot about how, Brown versus Board of Education changed the kind of conversations that he was having with his family members, and that they were now discussing going to different schools than the ones that they had to go to at that point. And I think that that's really an important thing to look at is we get a little piece of how he was introduced to it, which really will open up into the role that he would later play in the Freedom Summer movement, but also just in the civil rights movement in general. And then I would really like to thank Dr. Dixon for introducing me to Dr. McLemore, but also giving me the opportunity to do this today. And then I would like to thank Dr. McLemore for allowing the time to sit down and have a conversation with me and just kind of open up about his life and the things that made him who he is today, but also the events that happened in his life and how that has affected us. And then I would also like to thank both my parents for allowing me to stay up late those nights and reading about the Freedom Summer movement and the Freedom Summer murders, but also for sticking with me, as this is all that I've talked about since I have taken Dr. Dixon's class last spring. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reinhardt. This just shows how passionate you are. That's awesome. Next, we welcome Mr. Jack Small, presenting on exploring the spatial aspects of race in Wyoming.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'll get my presentation pulled up here and then we can get started. Okay, so the title of my presentation today is Exploring the Spatial Aspects of Race in Wyoming Classrooms. I'd like to open with a quotation. This is to start to build the bridge from what's kind of common knowledge in the field to what my research focused on. So this research is an outgrowth kind of over the past 30 years of various scholars who, when paying attention to practices like redlining, started to observe that those practices are extended to other areas that may not at first seem to follow from the definition of redlining. And in particular, I'd like to focus on this second quote: space must be normed and raced at the macro level, the local level, and ultimately even the micro level. And in my research in particular, we focus on schools, and because I am in Wyoming, this has been focused on Wyoming. So addressing the role of the researcher, I'm a first semester PhD student in math. And so I also have family in academia and have been around schools and universities my whole life. And so this is a near and dear issue to my heart. I have diverse educational experiences. I was born in Texas, lived in Qatar for 6 years, and have now lived in Wyoming for 6 years. And throughout, this is anecdotal, of course, but throughout each of those experiences had witnessed multiple examples of what I would now consider to be discriminatory practice in the classroom. And a year and a half ago, I took Dr. Dixon's Intro to African American Studies class, and through the process of that course, just started reading in active researchers' literature, and found this text, Critical Race Spatial Analysis, which I would highly recommend anyone to pick up. My research focuses on a kind of response to a particularly technical piece of this text, but there are a number of case studies and examples of studies that don't require quite as much statistical literacy. So the problem statement is essentially ability to perform in high school and college is strongly correlated to better health, income, and wealth. And in particular, my research focuses on access to math education in Wyoming, and math and STEM education in particular are very, very strongly correlated with better outcomes later in life. Therefore, the systemic denial of this education is an effective reinforcement of the supremacist paradigm. And when essentially the whole underpinning idea here is when the assignment of space becomes large scale, students can be redlined out of classrooms. So this research has been guided by a continuously developing set of research questions that originally stem from a piece that I read in this text. And over the course of conducting this research, we have, number one, completed a quantitative kind of branch of the study and have started to develop a qualitative branch that we'll get into later. So the idea here, which I'm going to try to not go into too much detail about the specifics of like the details, try not to get lost in the weeds here. So the idea is to use GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems. This is really just a program for analyzing data that's spatially distributed. So anything that happens with respect to a map can kind of be treated by this software. And the idea is, or the aim is, to investigate distributions of variables relating to performance and diversity, and to try to see if there are any correlations in that set of data. So trying to draw a connection with the other research that you've seen today. This use of data is designed to support grounded theory methodology. So we aim to collect and work with numerical facts empirically, honoring expectations of statistics in other sciences. And the eventual goal is to investigate guiding questions, which are things like, does diversity of the school or the average income of the student or the average expenditure per student, does that affect outcomes in standardized math testing? And then eventually the goal is to support qualitative investigation and contextualization of that data. So attempting to see, first of all, if there are these correlations, and attempting, second of all, to explain and investigate those and address them if necessary. So again, the theoretical perspective here is literacy in STEM fields is crucial to socioeconomic development and stability at all levels of aggregation. So whether you're looking at an individual, a community of people, or a larger group like a state or a country, access to STEM fields and having a healthy network of people in STEM is a massive indicator of both economic growth and stability. And again, the denial of education through the unspoken assignment of space in early education is not only a disservice to the affected students, but as addressed by the first bullet point, it is a preventative measure for people to acquire or to attain growth and sustainability in the economic sense. So first, what data did we use and how did we analyze it? And this again is kind of in response and reflecting of a study that came from the text that I highlighted earlier, that was conducted in Missouri, where they were able to get good results. We'll compare and contrast in a minute. So we aggregated data at the county level. I examined different ways of doing this, but unfortunately the county level was the easiest way to simplify the data set into something that's kind of consistent with itself. The variables examined were the offerings of advanced math courses, which for example are things like trig, geometry, stats, and pre-calc or calc itself. We looked at district spending per student and district enrollment. Both of these are just general indicators of what kind of expenditure is going on at the school at a per student level. And then for our indicators of diversity, we used the percent of students of color and FRL percentage, which FRL stands for free and reduced lunch. So this is kind of a proxy variable for students in poverty, or the students that would be eligible for free and reduced price lunches. The analysis, there's kind of two branches of it that are common in the research. One is using general sample statistics, and in this case, what's called Morin's 1 clustering. This is, again, without getting too technical, the idea there is you measure the amount that high numbers of whatever variable are associated with other nearby high numbers of that same variable. So for example, if in Laramie, we have a lot of math course offerings, and in a neighboring county, there are a lot of math course offerings, then that would count as clustering and would ideally show up in a statistical analysis. And the second branch that's growing in popularity in this branch of the literature is geographically weighted regression. I think it's on a previous slide. So again, without getting too technical, the idea here is to kind of reflect the idea of a line of best fit. What's special about geographically weighted regression is it takes into account population size, or in this case, district enrollment, to weight your variables differently, and deploys essentially a series of models that are aiming at getting a more accurate picture of where variables are correlated, if they're more correlated in one area than another, for example. Software use. I used two pieces of software that are both completely open source and free. One of the big themes in the literature is when you need software for this research. Just in order to make this research as accessible and reproducible to as many people as possible, it is always a good idea to use open source and free software. It just makes all of it more accessible. So I used a software package called QGIS, which is essentially just a general geographic statistical program for both doing some basic analysis and for presenting results primarily is what I used it for. And then GWR4 it just stands for geographically weighted regression, that bullet point 2 above. And that is just a free software package that in particular does this particular type of modeling that we were interested in using. Now, for the first part of my findings, something that's really important to emphasize is both of these statistics up here, which in brief, the p-value is unfortunately telling us that, and I ran the models in a variety of ways, some of which were pretty consistent with the literature and some of which I was just trying other things. I was not able to get less than 95% uncertainty, which is represented by the p-value. And in general, the R squared, which really just represents how much of your response variable, which in this case is the performance on standardized tests, how much of that variation is explained by the variables that you're counting as affecting that. So in this case, that would be how does your proportion of POC students affect the outcomes on math exams. One statistic that did come out of this that is useful in explaining what's at stake here is that 24%, and this number varies based on year, upwards of 30%. But we have a large proportion of students in Wyoming who come from a minority background, although it's kind of largely perceived as just an entirely white state. And 25% of students are in the free and reduced price lunches program. So while at first glance you may assume that this is maybe an inappropriate place to be conducting this study, there are actually quite a few individuals affected by whether or not this kind of redlining in the classroom is happening. So next, I want to move into to kind of start to explain my results, because I mean, particularly for me, from a statistical standpoint, neither of these statistics is what we're looking for. We're looking for uncertainty in other studies was able to go down to 0.1%, and R squared was able to come up to 75% of data being explained by the model. So first comparison I'd like to make, the study that I kind of drew my original work from was based on Missouri. As I mentioned, they were able to use 493 school districts and they also aggregated at the county or school district level. So essentially what this bottom two bullet points means is here in Wyoming, if you want to do data analysis at the county level, you have 48 points of data, which is towards the very bottom of what you would kind of consider a representative sample size. And in general, statistical methods are made with the idea that they will be applied to large sets of data. So this, I get into a little bit more of this comparison. Their R squared on kind of their primary models that they're running in the first article that I found had between 50 and 60% of variance explained by their model. And again, they were able to, this 0.001, if you just multiply by 100, gives you the percent certainty. So that's greater than 0.1% certainty on their results. So not quite explaining all of the variance, which you would expect with a chaotic data set, like who's being educated and how are they performing in school. But still quite a bit better than what we were able to attain in my attempts. So I wanted to compare this to Wyoming. We only have 43 points of data. And again, here are those summary statistics of how our model did. And we tried, one of the things you can do when working with statistical models is increasing your tolerance for error. And there was not really any amount of playing around with those tolerances that would make this model work any better. Now here I have on the top an example of a map that we were able to put together in my research as compared to a map of what they were able to put together in Missouri. Now the maps here are essentially, well, my map is exclusively addressing areas with high numbers of math courses. 10.6 there is just 2 standard deviations above. So this is places with, you can think of it as just a lot of math courses relative to other places in Wyoming, as compared to district enrollment. And the real thing to observe here is the relative lack of kind of observable clusters in Wyoming as compared to in Missouri. This top right area in black is the St. Louis metro area. And they were able to identify a couple of other statistically significant clusters going on in Missouri. Whereas in Wyoming, we don't see, it seems to be randomly distributed, with places like Albany County, which is where Laramie is, having higher offerings and also having higher enrollments, but then that not really being a ubiquitous pattern. So these maps demonstrate like their attempt at data analysis in Missouri was a lot more successful for at least this particular piece, and on a broader scale, just in general, than the study in Wyoming. So I want to really emphasize the meaning of a p-value, because it comes up a lot in all sorts of fields, and it's really easy to kind of misunderstand what exactly it's saying. So when I tell you that my model had a very high p-value, most people will interpret that as a negative result. Just whatever you expected, the opposite is actually happening. But really what a high p-value means is that we can't confirm that our data set doesn't just look like a randomly generated data set. And so all of that to say, as a conclusion, and over the past semester, I guess, I've been working with Dr. Dixon on developing an oral history branch of the project. In general, like there are a couple of methods I've looked into since this first quantitative branch that may have some promise in Wyoming, but unfortunately we're really limited by just the fact of how sparsely populated Wyoming is. We have 10 times less school districts than Missouri. And so this may just not be a suitable method for this region, and in general for more sparsely populated regions. As such, we're following up using oral history, and this will particularly be oral history interviews with, I think, high school students is the direction we're looking at the moment. Number one, this removes the statistical dependency on a quote unquote large enough sample size, which for Wyoming is the only way that we're gonna be able to make our results reliable. Unfortunately, it's just not a well-suited data set for statistical inquiry. And this is an appropriate follow-up to this research, because it positions students as experts in their own lives and experiences. So while originally some of the motivation for the research is that this is a very non-invasive way of identifying a problem going on, but unfortunately, if there's not an entirely non-invasive way of doing it, then the next best thing is to go and talk to the students directly, and kind of center their voices on their own experiences. And I believe, one, maybe two last slides, I can't remember. So I'll highlight this quote. Even in white spaces, people of color are associated with racialized non-white spaces and are therefore denied access to resources via culture of segregation arguments. Culture of segregation arguments in the literature are essentially the argument that differences in performance in education and in other spaces is rather than due to extrinsic factors such as oppression or systemic lack of access, or denial of access, excuse me, that differences in performance in schools and later in life are related to intrinsic factors instead. So people are less intelligent, less capable in some area. And Mills explains that people themselves are spaced or imprinted with the characteristics of a certain kind of space. I unfortunately didn't have time to include this in the slides, but Black students throughout various states, I've seen a number of statistics that vary between they are 2 times to 2.5 times as likely to be disciplined in the classroom, and discipline is negatively correlated with like later positive outcomes in school. Again, in Wyoming, we have 94,000 students, 24% at a minimum of whom are from minority backgrounds, and 25% of whom are eligible for free and reduced lunch. We also have a historical context in Wyoming of being the site of some questionable educational practices. The Native American schools that existed 100 years ago, and then the schools in Japanese internment camps 50 years ago, both come to mind as examples of places where we have systemically underserved groups of people that live in Wyoming. And yeah, so this is an important issue, although at face value, it may not seem like a place that this research would need to be done. This does affect quite a few people and have historical background that gives cause for concern. And I believe with that, that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank Dr. Dixon and all the other people that presented today. I've had a great time watching y'all's presentations. So yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you for presenting your brilliant research, Mr. Small. Let's now talk about the history and reality of the legacy of James Baldwin with Mr. J.W. Rzeszut.
All right, I hope everybody can see that. All right, so my research is based on the history and the reality of the identity of James Baldwin. And to start today, I would like to start by going into my problem statement. So perhaps the most central concern faced by the leaders of the civil rights movement was attempting to maintain positive communication with the white majority in order to subvert the false mainstream narratives about the efficacy of segregation and the inferiority of whites. I was trying to elucidate this idea through a specific quote from James Baldwin's book, Notes of a Native Son, in which he states, "The American ideal, after all, is that everyone should be able to be as much alike as possible." I believe that this quote truly embodies the motivation of Baldwin's work and how he extends the discussion of racial equality and the discussion of LGBT equality and the pursuit of true equality, which I will continue to analyze throughout this presentation. For my methodological approach, I decided to choose the narrative approach. The narrative model is specifically meant to focus on spoken or written words and visual representations, and this method often involves the analysis of stories or narratives in order to ascertain particular questions or issues. Throughout using this methodology, I tried to go ahead and apply a series of different parallels between the works of James Baldwin, and more specifically between the narrative of his life and his personal development and the resulting realization of his various identities as both a homosexual and a Black man living under Jim Crow. So throughout this methodology, I tried to draw sort of a parallel between the narrative of James Baldwin's life and the societal evolution of tolerance and acceptance of people of these two different categories, which he was a part of. So from my theoretical perspective, I have these three different aspects that I'm going to read off now. It is to inform people of the often forgotten values embedded in the great work of this historic intellectual, to demonstrate the boundaries that one's facticity places on the art in which they produce, and to educate people on the specific circumstances of James Baldwin, allowing him to produce such transcendental works according to these two axioms. So through these perspectives, I hope to present a very comprehensive and easily understandable sense of the perspectives of James Baldwin for general audiences, and ultimately show how influential he's been on African American studies and discourse within the last 40 to 50 years. My two research questions are contingent off of each other. The first one is, in what ways did James Baldwin's specific identities in the civil rights movement influence the literature which he produced? And then secondarily, building off of this primary question, I was focusing on what role did James Baldwin and his literature play in the dismantling of Jim Crow during the civil rights movement. I think both of these two questions are crucial to fully understanding the way that James Baldwin chose to live his life, and more specifically, the massive influence that he was able to have in the fairly productive discourse, which has brought us to the way that we regard these issues in modern day. Finally, the role of the researcher. I wanted to understand the baseline of graduate study rigor and expectations through participating in this study and presentation. I wanted to expand my breadth of knowledge in regards to counter-narrative history and social justice, and I would like to present these studies in an intuitive and didactic way in order to benefit society as a whole, and just overall spread awareness about the influence and the great value that James Baldwin has produced for the advancement of our society, particularly in regards to LGBT and African American rights, and ultimately how he's contributed to this discourse as a whole. So to begin explaining this sort of narrative of James Baldwin's life, we really have to go to the very beginning and discuss his early life. James Baldwin was born on August 2nd, 1924 in Harlem Hospital to a single mother named Emma Jones, and was later adopted by his stepfather, who had many children with Miss Jones, causing Baldwin to ultimately become the older brother of 9 different children. His stepfather, David Baldwin, was a very talented Baptist preacher, resulting in Baldwin's early involvement with rhetoric, and ultimately this resulted in sort of early on tensions between his relationship with his stepfather and ultimately his family as a whole, because while he did not know it while he was much younger, during his early teens, Baldwin began to have homosexual urges, and ultimately this led to his identification with the LGBT community. And due to his stepfather's more conservative Christian beliefs, this ultimately led to some tensions between Baldwin and his family, which we will see play out later in this presentation. Baldwin attended Public School 24, which is a very small and poor public school in Central Harlem for elementary education, and he was soon rapidly exceeding his peers' abilities, which allowed him to go ahead and advance to a higher quality standard of education when he attended Frederick Douglass Junior High and was ultimately able to be accepted into the very competitively selective DeWitt Clinton High School. Throughout his time in high school and middle school, Baldwin showed great literary potential, a profound interest in literature and theater, and really just the arts in general. But despite this profound competence and these abilities to interact with literature that was far beyond his peers, he ultimately was unable to proceed to going to college because of his circumstances. According to biographer David Leemings, Baldwin was in fact so precocious with his literary abilities that he was able to read books by authors like Charles Dickens and Fyodor Dostoevsky in the 5th grade. So he was interacting with literature, which many of us in college still aren't fully accustomed to, while he was really only 10, 11, 12 years old, showing that he was a very intelligent and precocious young man, which ultimately allowed him to evolve into who he has become as a historic figure. Now, to get into the young adulthood of James Baldwin, I think it's first most important to mention his relationship with his family and how this affected his inability to get a college education. Despite his profound potential, Baldwin was unable and to some extent unwilling to attend college. His family was still very poor, trying to sustain 9 children plus himself, so he ultimately decided it would be more valuable for him to go ahead and pursue a career and try and be able to send money back to help his family than to go ahead and pursue college. And while this was a very altruistic act on his part, it also led to some unfortunate tensions between his family, which ultimately allowed him to be alienated from them later in his life. While in his early 20s, during and around World War II, James Baldwin was contracted for the United States Army, where he worked for the construction of a train depot. And it was during this very early part of his career that he gained a deeper sense of racial consciousness, which was later displayed in his story, Notes of a Native Son. One particular example of this is a story that Baldwin tells in regards to how, a incident that occurred while he tried to attend a segregated restaurant while he was working with the Army. And when he went into the restaurant, they were trying to deny him service, and this ultimately enraged him, causing him to lash out and to throw a coffee mug at one of the waitresses. While as he matured, he was able to go ahead and find much more productive and socially acceptable ways to vent his anger towards the injustice of segregation. This shows how passionate of a young man that he was, and how he was ultimately determined to try and go ahead and show this injustice as being wrong. It was around this same time that James Baldwin became more in touch with his homosexuality, which furthered the tensions between himself and his family. According to a biographer and queer historian Randall Keenan, Baldwin sought refuge from the terrifying implications of his newfound sexual identity and religion, namely the Mount Calvary of the Pentecostal Faith Church. This church was rather progressive, being led by a female bishop and clergyman, and this tragically ignited the process of alienation between Baldwin and his stepfather in particular. Baldwin became involved in preachment in this Pentecostal church, and this ultimately helped him to refine his rhetorical and literary abilities to the point which he is historically recognized as being so talented for today. After this time of working in the Army concluded, Baldwin moved to Greenwich Village, New York, and moved in with one of his good friends from high school, a gay man named Buford Delaney, who was a modernist painter. Due to his involvement with Buford Delaney, and then his later relationship that he began with his temporary partner Eugene Worth, Baldwin was exposed to many different progressive philosophical and artistic ideas. He was exposed to avant-garde paintings through his friend Delaney being a modernist painter. He was involved to the more radically progressive socialist beliefs of people like the Soviet theorist Leon Trotsky, which ultimately influenced his views on the efficacy of capitalism, which he ultimately condemned. And then he, during this time, he rediscovered his passion for theater. And just an interesting fun fact is while he was participating in community theater, the young James Baldwin actually met the famous Oscar winner and Oscar-winning actor from movies such as The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, Marlon Brando. And it is often believed, however, ultimately unconfirmed, that they had a romantic relationship during their time together in community theaters. So I just think that that's an interesting fact to share about James Baldwin. Now, to get into some of the more rhetorical aspects of James Baldwin's life, I would like to talk about his selected works and his time in Europe. In 1946, after Eugene Worth tragically passed away from suicide at a very young age, Baldwin moved to Paris, affiliating himself with cultural critics called the Left Bank, which ultimately allowed him to further refine his writing and rhetorical ability and intensified his opposition to the standard right-wing practices that he was noticing in his home country of America. While in Paris, Baldwin completed and published his first three most famous novels, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Notes of a Native Son, and Giovanni's Room. The first two novels involve strong themes of racial subjugation, which we can trace to Baldwin's personal experiences in his education and early working life, whilst the third novel provides a cautionary tale, which biographer James Campbell described as a tale of one's love's inhibition, which drew clear inspiration from Baldwin's sexual identity and his fear of persecution for it, which we see heavily reflected in his experiences living in Greenwich Village. As a Black man, Baldwin felt himself to be a secondhand citizen, a common theme in these themes of racial tragedy that he tells, such as that of Go Tell It on the Mountain. Alternatively, as a homosexual, Baldwin was able to provide stories of secrecy and anti-establishmentarianism, such as that of Giovanni's Room. And it was in these counter-narratives produced by artistic reflection of Baldwin's unique intersectional identities of homosexuality and Blackness, which ultimately act as central themes in the breadth of his work, and later found strong resonance in the emerging countercultures of the civil rights movement, which are so crucial to the world that we understand today. It was through these three novels that Baldwin was ultimately able to gain his fame, and this ultimately allowed him to have such a powerful platform in his involvement during the civil rights era. Baldwin was inspired to return to America and to start focusing on political issues due to a combination of events, including the arrest of Rosa Parks, the Brown v. Board of Education, and the infamous and tragic lynching of Emmett Till, which ultimately prompted him to return to New York in 1955 and begin a series of rhetoric with various different aspects of the civil rights movement and trying to present these in a very professional way to white audiences who were to some extent uncomfortable with the ideas that were being tossed around in these circles. And perhaps the most blatant evidence of this involvement can be seen in his relationships with the NAACP president, Medgar Evers, the famous Martin Luther King Jr., and the equally famous Malcolm X. These stories are detailed throughout his essay, No Name in the Street, and his unfinished manuscript, which ultimately inspired me to research this, Remember This House. It was through these interactions with these three horsemen of racial progress that Baldwin became immersed in the rhetoric of the civil rights movement. Baldwin encouraged a Christian-inspired message of love and tolerance, which brought him into direct conflict with the Nation of Islam and other Black nationalist-leaning organizations. Concurrently, Baldwin also clashed in the public eye with what we now know to be the white opposition to more anti-establishment aspects of the civil rights movement, and more specifically, the integrationalist movement, which Baldwin so vehemently supported. And one particular example of this is just more economically radical and likely necessary decisions, such as MLK's support of wealth redistribution, which did not sit well with the white ruling class of America at the time. So Baldwin is ultimately sort of an apologist for this in order to go and try to convince people, white people, that desegregation was necessary and did not necessarily lead to radical politics. And one famous instance of this dialogue that Baldwin produced is the public debate that he had with famous conservative pundit William F. Buckley, which was ultimately put him in both infamy, but also helped develop Baldwin's platform to be so influential in mediating between more radical Black nationalist groups and more reactionary white majority culture. So overall, just discussing the legacy of James Baldwin, I think it's important to go ahead and remember how crucial his involvement to the civil rights movement was in defending a very just and easily applicable form of racial integrationalism, which is basically what we consider to some extent to be the norm in modern day America. Throughout his later life, Baldwin continued to write, moving between his residences in Cuba and the French countryside, and he continued to write, but never was able to achieve the same success that he had in his youth, often leaving his work unfinished. This continued until his tragic premature death as a result of stomach cancer on December 1st, 1987, at the age of 63. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of this of his young death is the fact that he outlived all of the three aforementioned horsemen of racial progress: Medgar Evers, MLK, and Malcolm X. I think to some extent we can see sort of the psychological effect that the assassinations of many of Baldwin's allies in the civil rights movement had on his later work, and I think this ultimately is what led to him leaving the public eye for the last 15 or so years of his life. However, overall, when looking at Baldwin's legacy, we have to remember how crucial he was in not just the civil rights era, but pioneering the LGBT movement and solidifying racial equality. And all of this overall was made possible by Baldwin's unique identity of being both a gay man and a Black man in a time when neither of these were really acceptable in America, and ultimately led to persecution and pain for many of the people who just so happened to be born with these particular identities. Ultimately, these identities throughout the narrative of James Baldwin's life allowed him to go ahead and develop particular experiences which gave him very useful perspectives, which are able to resonate heavily in the literature which he produced, and with such artistic quality, which allowed him to go ahead and create and help pioneer these great movements, which are so crucial to our understanding of equality and tolerance and acceptance in America today. So here are my sources, and then overall, I would just like to get some acknowledgments to my family for the support and perspectives that they have given me for their entire life. I would like to thank Professor Frederick Douglass Dixon for his guidance and support in this project, and I would like to thank the producers and organizers of the documentary "I Am Not Your Negro," which was based off of the aforementioned "Remember This House" manuscript, which was unfinished and was a very influential piece of literature in my understanding of racial consciousness, and ultimately my inspiration for producing this presentation. So thank you everybody so much, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you for this presentation. Our last student presenter today is Miss Madison Greenberg, who will talk about the modern day American lynching movement and police brutality.
Hi, my name is Madison, and I'm pretty sure you guys can see the screen. So my project is the modern day American lynching movement, police brutality. So before I start, I want to give a little content warning. In this presentation, I address lynching as well as some graphic images, so if that's something you would not like to see, feel free to turn away now. Thesis. One of the longest movements in the United States history is the American lynching movement. Though most recollections of this movement say it lasted from 1870 to 1950, I argue that the American lynching movement is still going on today, manifesting through police departments across the country. Methodology and perspective. The methodological approach I chose to take is a case study. A case study involves getting a detailed examination of a person, event, or community. I chose this approach because it allows for a total understanding of the system, how it works, and the flaws that allow for such horrifying events to occur. Next, my perspective is the standpoint theory. This states that marginalized groups are socially situated in a way that makes it more possible for them to be aware of things and ask questions than those who aren't marginalized. So my research question is, does the abuse the Black community is subjected to by police count as lynching? Role of the researcher. I've always been taught to stand up for what I believe in, and with that, I've always been very aware of the inequality in this country. It's something that has really bothered me. With this project, I challenge the mainstream narrative as well as work to rewrite that narrative to give light to what an issue police brutality actually is. What it is. So before getting into my project, I wanted to acknowledge how loaded of a word lynching is. I chose lynching on purpose because it emphasizes the sociality of something that has become increasingly normalized and with that desensitized in this society. In addition to that, I chose lynching because while using the definition of the word and analyzing the system of police brutality, I realized that lynching is still going on in this country. Finally, I wanted to lay out the definitions of lynching, and I will be referring back to these definitions throughout my presentation. So both of these definitions I pulled from the NAACP, and the first one states, a lynching is the public killing of an individual who has not received any due process. These executions were often carried out by lawless mobs, though police officers did participate under the pretext of justice. And then the second one, a typical lynching involved a criminal accusation, an arrest, the assembly of a mob, followed by seizure, physical torment, and murder of the victim. Lynchings were often public spectacles attended by the white community in celebration of white supremacy. Where it all started. So here's the first law that allowed for lynching, and I'm not going to read it all, but it's up there in case you would like to. Anyways, to set the tone, this was in the Virginia Colonial Assembly in 1669, and in it, the law states that slave owners cannot be charged for killing their slaves. Specifically, it states, by the extremity of correction, should chance to die, that his death shall not be accompanied felon. One thing I'd like to point out here, in which we can see in current day police brutality cases, is the idea of death coming from a correction. This is something I'll go later into during the presentation. So this is Eric Gardner, for those of you who don't know, and he died of police brutality in 2014. What happened with Mr. Gardner is that he broke up a fight in Staten Island, and afterwards 2 police officers approached him and started questioning Gardner about illegally selling cigarettes. It was during this encounter that one of the officers, Mr. Daniel Pregnon, put Gardner in a chokehold, which is an illegal tactic to use in the NYPD. After Gardner pled, I can't breathe 11 times, he eventually died. The illegal chokehold. So here I'm going to show a clip of the encounter with Mr. Gardner and the 2 officers. If that's something you would not like to see, feel free to turn away from the computer, put it on silent, whatever you got to do. Anyways, while watching this clip, I want you guys to think of a quote from the United States Attorney Richard Donahue. The evidence does not support charging Police Officer Pregnon with a federal civil rights violation, and how that quote connects with the quote I pulled earlier from the 1669 legislation about death in form of a correction. So here's the video. I hope you guys can see it.
On tape by a bystander.
I'm minding my business, officer. I'm minding my business. Please just leave me alone.
That's Garner, a black 43-year-old father of 6 weighing 350 pounds. Several New York City police officers are about to take him down.
Don't touch me. Don't touch me.
Look closely. One officer, Daniel Pantaleo, who is white, has his arm around Garner's neck.
So in that video, you see Officer Daniel Pregnon and Officer Justin Diamaco approach and seize Mr. Gardner. In addition to that, you see Mr. Pregnon use a chokehold on Mr. Gardner, eventually killing him. Now this tactic, again, was illegal among NYPD officers, and even with him using an illegal tactic and killing Mr. Gardner, he was never charged for his actions. This relates back to the 1669 quote because we see an individual killing a black man as a result of correction and see that there was no legal consequence for Mr. Pregnon. How it was a lynching. Here again are the 2 definitions from the NAACP, and I'm going to go through the criteria here and relate it back to Mr. Gardner's case. So first, public. This did happen on a public street in Staten Island. There were plenty of people around to witness, and as we just saw, the video of it is online for anyone to see. 2, criminal accusation. Gardner was allegedly illegally selling cigarettes. 3, no due process. In this interaction, we see 2 officers become judge, jury, and executioner, subjecting the death penalty for Gardner's alleged activities. And then the last 3, again, we see the officers seize, physically torment, and eventually murder Mr. Gardner. Lynching as a public spectacle. Another big part of the NAACP definition says how lynchings were often public spectacles. Now, during the height of the American lynching movement, we see things like picnics, an event where white people of all backgrounds would come together and eat lunch and watch a lynching. Almost similar to how carnivals are community events today, these picnics would transcend generations, religions, gender, and social class. It transcended everything and became an event of white supremacy where all white people could enjoy food and watch the death and torture of a black individual. These lynching mobs, like the officers who lynched Mr. Gardner, would become judge, jury, and executioner of Black men and women. You can see this in instances where picnics and publics weren't used as a form of entertainment, like in the Emmett Till case. A mob came after him after he allegedly raped and assaulted Carolyn Bryant. They became his judge, jury, and executioner, and like Mr. Gardner, he was sentenced to the death penalty. Now, although his death was in private, this did not stop it from becoming a public spectacle. News on Till's death took the country by storm, and we can still see it impacting us today with things like the recent Till movie that came out earlier this past year. Today, we see lynchings in a similar light, and though it may not be an event people enjoy like a carnival, it nonetheless is a spectacle that attracts a ton of attention. From the people on the streets witnessing the lynchings to those at home watching it on their smartphones. Lynching as a spectacle is still in effect, and the only difference is its modernity. As time progresses, so has lynchings, and we see its current day enhancement manifesting through police brutality. Gardner's death, a public spectacle. We can use Gardner's death as an example of how lynchings are public spectacles in today's time. A large part of this is the impact of social media. It's the newest platform of media where the spectacle of lynching today really takes off on. It's on social media where you can find the video of Mr. Gardner and dozens of other lynching victims. It's where everyone gets a voice and gets a place to express their outrage. A great example of this is the Twitter outrage after Mr. Gardner's death. This transcends space and time. We can see even though Gardner died almost 10 years ago, we still recently see things on social media about him. For instance, protests as recent as 2019 for Gardner's death have been promoted and set about on social media. The role of the media. So warning, the next slide is going to be very graphic. However, it is nonetheless extremely important to point out the realities of violence. If this is not something you want to see, again, turn away from the screen. The idea of modernity is extremely important when discussing the role of media in lynchings. Modernity is the modern way of thinking, working, etc. Social media is the modern way of accessing information. Because of that, we've seen a rise in concern and outrage over lynchings. Police have always been extremely brutal to the Black community. You can see this going back to slave patrols. It's not a new phenomenon. However, with social media and the ease of sharing and accessing information, it's being broadcasted on a scale like never before. Modernity is the link between the media and lynchings as they were in the 20th century and prior to lynchings today. In the past, lynchings were occurrences of no escape. With things like sundown towns and picnics, lynchings terrorized the Black community. Not only were people being murdered at random, but they also had to clean up the mess. After lynching, it was typically a Black man who would have to go collect the body. What does that do to the psyche? How does he continue on after that? How does he continue after seeing this, after seeing newspaper article after newspaper article with photos of lynchings in them, with the bodies hanging throughout the town for all to see? How does his family, his community, continue? What does he teach to the next generation to avoid such fate? Maybe to be extremely polite, avoid sundown towns. There's a protocol of behavior that the Black community must adhere to, and even when they do, there's a chance they still might face the awful fate. What does this teach white supremacy? It upholds the system, makes the white community believe they should get nothing but the utmost respect, and a slight deviation from this, what does it mean? Now think of today's time. How does the Black community continue after seeing report after report of another Black individual dying at the hands of those who are supposed to serve and protect? What effect does seeing body cam and phone footage of yet another severe beating, shooting, or suffocation have? You go home, teach your kid how to interact with cops, teach them how a simple traffic violation can lead to such horror if you don't act on your utmost behavior. With that, what does it teach the officers? There's this idea that some populations need to be policed differently than others. With modernity, you can see the connection from one time period to the other. You can see the connection in how police brutality is the modern day form of lynching. Modernity can also help connect how the media is involved in such cases. For instance, think again back to Emmett Till and to the recent passing of Tyre Nichols. During Till's time, his mom made a conscious choice to release to the media the photo of Emmett after his death. However, Tyre's mom was not able to make that choice. The photo, the video of his beating, all of it would have been released to the media at some point, regardless of the family's position on it. We see this with almost every other Black individual who's killed by police today. Their death is just up on the internet for anyone to see whenever they please. The idea of policing differently. Since the origin of this country, there's been a fixation on the control of the Black community. This started out in slavery with things like slave patrols, and then later turned into Black codes and Jim Crow as time went on. Today, we see this manifesting through police brutality. For instance, Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police, and in a majority of cities, police kill Black individuals at higher rates than they kill white. You can even look towards our own backyard at the incident that happened in Washakie earlier this week, where a few officers pinned down a Black man and carried him out of the cafeteria. Why is this? Why do some people get treated with violence because of preconceived notions while others can walk free? Where do we go from here? So my opinion, which may be heavily biased, is that because the police system is based off slave patrols, the entire system is incredibly corrupt, and there's no way of real change unless we scratch our current system and start over. However, a more realistic solution is that we start holding police officers accountable, and instead of getting a slap on the wrist, they receive more just punishment for their horrific crimes. In addition to that, we should increase diversity programs and trainings police officers must go through, as well as prohibit and stick to their word all practices that could result in death. And then there are my sources.
Sorry about that. You couldn't hear me the whole time. Thank you so much for this presentation, Ms. Greenberg. A much needed presentation, I believe. So this was the last student research presentation for today, but we do conclude this event with attorney Lauren McLean and Mr. Luke Dante of the Defender Aid Clinic. They will engage in a workshop presentation that centers on the historical and problematic issues of the all-white jury, in the modern day lynching mob.
All right. Thank you so much, Maya. Appreciate you. Luke, I'll go ahead and turn it to you to get the PowerPoint going while I just introduce us. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren McLean. I'm a professor over at the law school and at the University of Wyoming. And good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're at in the world. Thanks for joining us. I am the faculty director of the Defender Aid Clinic. We are a non-reformist reform clinic. So I'll let you do that translation. But in short, we seek to dismantle the criminal legal system. I call it the criminal legal system because there is no justice in this system in which we operate. The system is working as it was designed to work, so to speak, as Andrea Ritchie and Mariam Kaba might say. My good friend Matt Klein pointed out that quote to me the other day. So Luke and I are here today to talk with you about the all-white jury, and that the all-white jury is the modern-day racial terror lynching mob. Luke, do you have that PowerPoint up and going?
Yeah, I'm opening it up right now. It
Very
took a
good.
minute. I had to grant access.
No problem. Okay, so what you're going to see as we start our presentation, and it's so great to come right off of what Madison's talking about, modern day lynching through police practices. We're going to talk about how the all-white jury, so even after a person might be accosted by police, they're then put through a prosecution. They might actually be potentially lynched again, depending on our definition of lynching that we're operating under, by an all-white jury. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Herbert Richardson. You're going to see his picture here in a minute on the PowerPoint, but this work is really dedicated to Herbert Richardson, who is a former client of attorney Brian Stevenson. Many of you may recognize that name. He started the Equal Justice Initiative and is a fantastic civil rights attorney, advocate, all things. Really, even though I've never met him, a mentor of mine. Herbert Richardson was a Black Vietnam War veteran. Here he is right here. He fought on the front lines in the Vietnam War. And much like Black veterans were coming home from World War II and were being lynched and accosted by white people, well, Herbert didn't come home to a lynching in that traditional sense, but he was lynched by an all-white jury. He was honorably discharged for mental illness and in particular PTSD, which they were just starting to learn a little bit about during that time. He was executed in 1989 in Alabama. He suffered significant mental health problems when he came back from the war. He was on the front lines, as I mentioned. At least in one incident, his entire platoon was killed except for him. He was the lone survivor. He came back to New York to heal in a hospital. He would often have crying outbursts, suicide attempts, and you could hear him screaming out incoming at random times. He was treated by a nurse and a staff, of course, there at the Veterans Hospital in New York. He fell in love with that nurse and ended up following her to Alabama, even after she broke off their relationship. One day, Herbert decided that he was going to place a bomb on her front porch. And his intention was to run in and save the day, much like he'd done at Vietnam, and be able to prove and demonstrate his love for her. You can see that this was not tethered to reality in any sense. A young girl, unfortunately, picked up the package. I think it was a relative of the nurse. Ruby May was her name. She shook the package. It detonated, and she died. Of course, Mr. Richardson was tried for murder, capital murder, murder in the first degree, which requires an intention to murder, an intention to kill. It was never argued at his trial by his white attorney that he had PTSD, that this was mental illness, that there was not that intent to kill. Unfortunately, none of that was introduced whatsoever. The prosecutor had the audacity to stand up and refer to Mr. Richardson as the Black Muslim who came down here to us in Alabama from New York. He also struck all the Black jurors from Mr. Richardson's jury trial. So Mr. Richardson was tried and hung by an all-white jury. With that and that dedication, I'll turn it over to Luke Dainty. Luke is the student director of of the Defender Aid Clinic. He is a third-year law student who wishes to go into this area of reformist work. So this is all you, Luke. Go for it.
Awesome. And like Lauren said, should be graduating in May. I got my undergrad in religious studies. So if there's any of the few religious studies majors out there, shout out. But what I'll be doing is going through how we got here from mostly a legal perspective and mixed in with a little bit of like social history that was occurring at the same time as some of these legal mechanisms were being used to sort of transition from the lynching mobs post-Reconstruction, or even during Reconstruction lynching mobs, to the all-white jury. So first, I'm going to give a brief overview of racial terror lynchings. I think Ms. Greenberg did a great job, but these sort of rose to prominence after the abolition of slavery. They were extrajudicial mechanisms used to maintain a majoritarian narrative of white supremacy. And that's something we're going to come back to. I'm going to come back to a lot throughout this presentation, is the majoritarian narrative. Like the key makers, the people that hold the positions of power that sort of, create what history is in the eyes of the majority. And as we'll see, a lot of that majority is white, male, higher income, and hetero. These lynchings were often public spectacles, as can be seen through what is probably the most infamous picture of a lynching of Henry Smith, in Paris, Texas. And the decline of these racial terror lynchings statistically occurred in conjunction with the rise of capital punishment being imposed in the courts. And just for a statistical perspective, from 1865 to 1876, a period that many would call Reconstruction, we're coming out of the Civil War. The South is in many ways being forced to reconcile with a lot of the atrocities that were occurring then and after. But there were more than 2,000 African Americans that were the victims of racial terror lynchings, which kind of is counter to that majoritarian notion of this sort of blissful experience post-Civil War. So then we move to sort of the rise of how juries become all white. First, we've got constitutional provisions, specifically Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution, and Article 1, Section 2, which most notoriously contained the 3/5 compromise. These denied Black individuals the right to service on juries because it classified enslaved Black people as property, as chattel property. And then we move into the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789, which stated that, quote, jurors shall have the same qualifications as are requisite for jurors by the laws of the state of which they are citizens. And jury eligibility was linked to voting through constitutional interpretation, most prevalently with those two articles mentioned above, or clauses, I guess. And so by linking that eligibility to voting and denying voting through constitutional mechanisms, we get our first arise of all-white juries. And then as states are given the power to sort of determine who is voting, who's serving on juries, the majority of states exclude also freed Black people from jury service. So this isn't just a problem solely in the South, where enslavement is at a higher, or enslavement occurs, but it's also a problem in the North, where states have chosen to exclude Black individuals from jury service. So then we move on to this early majoritarian narrative. And we have the Sixth Amendment that states that in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed. However, this right, the Sixth Amendment right that's enshrined in the Constitution, is not extended to those that are classified as chattel property and excluded from full citizenship, as we've seen with these constitutional amendments in the states and actions of regressive laws. The Sixth Amendment was informed by the Magna Carta. The judgment of his peers language comes from the Magna Carta. It's kind of changed and altered a little bit as it's instituted in the Sixth Amendment, but the Magna Carta is a legal doctrine from 1215, and the researchers at Cornell have discovered it and kind of concluded that this is the first taste of colorblindness within the law. And when I say colorblindness, it's sort of a cloak of equality that's used by majoritarian groups to avoid the discussion of discrimination and racism within the law, within the legal community. And it sort of rejects the idea that everyone is implicitly biased, and we should deal with that moving forward. So as the rise of the all-white jury becomes prominent, we start to get away from the traditional racial terror lynching mobs. It goes from an overt system of white supremacy to this sort of colorblind system that's implicit within the systemic structures, within the legal mechanisms, documents in the legal field. So it becomes a sort of system-wide framework. And I included this picture here. This is of the Earl Warren Court, which is considered by a lot the probably the most progressive court throughout the history of the Supreme Court. And every single person on there fits into that majoritarian class that I mentioned earlier, is white, male, higher income, etc. So we start to get protections implemented during Reconstruction. So we've got the 14th Amendment, which is ratified in 1868, and it guarantees equal protection under the law and due process. And we have the 15th Amendment just a couple years later in 1870 that says you can't deny the right to vote on account of race or previous conditions of servitude. Under the fact that you're a previous slave can't mean that you can't vote. And then we also have the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which outlawed race-based discrimination in jury selections. However, these protections, and they're put in quotation marks on purpose, were enforced irregularly or not at all, especially in the South. So we continue the majoritarian class continues the exclusion of Black people from juries, and the Civil Rights of 1875 is effectively overturned only 8 years later. Yeah, 8 years. I'm a lawyer, not a math, student. In United States v. Harris, which states that the 14th Amendment only applies to state action, and it's not enforceable against racial terror groups and private groups such as the KKK. And the person who constructed that opinion is Justice Woods, over here pictured on my right side. I believe it's your right side as well. And effectively, Justice Woods' opinion is doing the metaphorical pilot washing of the hand, saying, hey, we can control what the state actors can do, but we can't control what these private groups are choosing to do. So it takes all the teeth out of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 within the decade. And then we start getting into more case law here, and cases start to become sort of crafting this narrative of what juries should look like and what due process and equal protection looks like. So in Strouder versus West Virginia, in 1879, so we're at that post-Reconstruction period, it overturned a state statute that specifically restricted jury service to white people. And it articulated that West Virginia's exclusionary law violated the 14th Amendment. However, it still approved restrictions that would deny African Americans the right to jury service and approved limiting jury service to certain groups. So the language from the case is it's approving limiting service to males, to freeholders, to citizens, to persons of certain ages, or I think importantly, to persons having educational qualifications. And these, sort of cop-outs are used as, are used tactically later on to continue the exclusion of Black people from juries. So a couple of ways that Strouder is skirted is through an 1898 Louisiana state constitutional amendment, whose purpose was to establish the supremacy of the white race. That's the quote. And it permitted non-unanimous jurors, which was not undone until 2020 in the Ramos decision. And by allowing non-unanimous verdicts in a state like Louisiana, it increased the likelihood that minoritized voices were meaningless on juries because, say it's a 10-2 decision and there's 10 white people and 2 minority individuals on the jury, that conviction is still going through. The person in question, the defendant in question, is still having that sentence levied against them and being found guilty. We've also got social control tactics being used post-Strouder, where local officials would remove Black citizens' names from jury rolls. And we also have a key man system where prominent white community members would submit lists of suitable jurors to commissioners. So these prominent white individuals would give lists of suitable jurors, which were almost always members of that majoritarian class that was mentioned and given as a cop-out in Strouder. So then we move to Brownfield v. South Carolina, which is a few decades later in 1903. And an all-white jury convicted an African-American man, despite African-Americans comprising 80% of the population of the registered voters in that county in South Carolina. And the Supreme Court in this instance rejected a jury discrimination claim and somehow found the record supported no wrongdoing, sort of reinforcing that all white juries are fine, they're okay, and there's no expectation for someone to have people that look like them on the jury deciding their fate. And this is a picture of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the author of that particular Supreme Court opinion. And Oliver Wendell Holmes is considered by many the sort of, Mount Rushmore figure within the legal field. And it just goes to show that this sort of majoritarian narrative was being implemented by almost everyone involved at that sort of elite time. And then we move to Martin v. Texas. It's just a few years later in 1906, but it reiterates that notion of the all-white jury being fine. The Supreme Court, the same court, upheld the death sentences of the appellants in this case and rejected any racial discrimination claims about the jury service. And now this is a really seminal case. It's called Norris v. Alabama. It's in 1935, so it's about 30 years after Martin. It's colloquially referred to as the Scottsboro 9 case. And the Scottsboro 9 were 9 young black men that are pictured in the foreground here that were convicted by all white juries in Alabama. And to the recollection, there's a lot of history that's been, a historical analysis that's been done on this case. And it was found that no African American had served on the jury in recent memory in Scottsboro in Alabama, despite African Americans comprising a large portion of the county and the town. So the Supreme Court reversed the convictions, which is I guess, an incremental step forward. However, this case is consistently framed as a case protecting the right to competent counsel. That's the way us law students learn it in classes like criminal procedure and criminal adjudication. So it's still sort of saying, oh, this constitutional amendment that says you have the right to competent counsel is being desecrated here. And it's not really, it's refusing to talk about the uncomfortable sort of anti-colorblindness notion that the all-white jury was at the center of the problem of the Scottsboro 9 case. Then we still have more covert methods of Black jury exclusion. We have allegations that African Americans lacked intelligence, experience, and moral integrity to serve. So you're going back to almost the exact language from Strouder and claiming that they're just not fit to serve on juries. And we have peremptory strikes, which I'll explain that in a moment. But that's essentially just the ability to kick off without reason anyone from your potential jury. And then Georgia voting officials would actually print the names of Black citizens on colored paper so they could avoid picking them during the random drawings for jury pools. So if you're fishing around for, like through pieces of red construction paper and normal white paper, you're going to be able to pull out, have your pick of who you want in terms of the racial classifications of potential jurors. And then the officials would also rely on tax returns that were segregated by race in order to comprise potential juries. And then Aikens v. Texas in 1945, so we're coming out of World War II, the Supreme Court upheld the policy of allowing only a single African American to serve on each jury, which was a Texas law at the time. And the commissioner in Aikens testified that he had no intention of placing more than one Negro on the panel. So we've got intention. They don't want to allow Black people on these juries, and still this sort of regressive notion is upheld in 1945. And I included a picture of the Tuskegee Airmen here because we were more than fine with incorporating Black men specifically into the military-industrial complex and sending them overseas to fight against fascism. But when they return home, and Lauren kind of touched on this earlier with the story of Herbert Richardson, when they return home, they're not afforded fundamental rights, even though they're war heroes in most, if not all's eyes. And then we moved to Swain v. Alabama, which is a predecessor to probably the most seminal case that we'll talk about today. And in Swain, the court set an impossible test to meet in establishing what is a racially discriminatory peremptory challenge. So the way that jury selection works is you have for-cause challenges and you have peremptory challenges. And for-cause challenges are used during jury selection, which is commonly called voir dire. And you get an unlimited amount of for-cause challenge if you can talk to someone and find that their bias or prejudice would drastically impact their ability to be unbiased against one of the parties. So if you talk to an individual and they indicate that they have bias or prejudice prior to the trial, you can challenge them for cause, and the judge will determine if they're can be rehabilitated or not, and they can ultimately be kicked off the potential jury veneer because of that prejudice or bias. Peremptory challenges, on the other hand, can be used almost indiscriminately, and until this Swain case that established an almost impossible racial discriminatory challenge against peremptory challenges, you can basically just decide, I don't want this person, not because of what they said during the jury selection process, but because, maybe I've done research on them. I don't, and what it really turns into is I didn't like how this person looked. This is the racial discriminatory issue that we're talking about. So we'll get into peremptory challenges a little bit more, but I do want to note that for-cause challenges, the sort of unlimited amount that you have, if you can get people to articulate bias during the jury selection process, are used at disproportionate rates against African Americans and other minorities. And then peremptory challenges came to the forefront. Oh, and I did include, again, we have this picture of a Black soldier in Vietnam, Sergeant Clyde Brown Jr. Once again, we're willing to incorporate Black men and Black individuals into the military-industrial complex, but are continuing to deny them fundamental rights on American soil. So then we move into Batson versus Kentucky, which is the controlling federal law currently with this issue. And it stood for the Equal Protection Clause prohibiting using peremptory challenges, those and I forgot to mention that in Wyoming and during a criminal trial, you typically get 8. So you can use these challenges to pick people off of your jury that you think will be adverse to your particular party. So it prohibits using peremptory challenges to exclude jurors based on race, and it's also been interpreted as extending to gender. The court also determined that this did not apply retroactively. So all of the people that were negatively harmed by the ability to keep minorities and specifically African Americans off of a jury, the court said, well, there's really no remedy for that, but they do articulate a 3-part test. And the 3-part test is you have to make a case of purposeful discrimination, and then the person who is being claimed, typically the prosecution, has to give a race-neutral reason for kicking off that person using a peremptory challenge. And then eventually the trial court determines whether the defendant has met their burden of demonstrating purposeful discrimination under the totality of the circumstances. And it's intentionally ambiguous language, purposeful discrimination under the totality of the circumstances. And Justice Marshall immediately recognized the issue with the language of Batson. And in his concurrence, he states that merely allowing defendants the opportunity to challenge racially discriminatory use of peremptory challenges in individual cases will not end the illegitimate use of the peremptory challenges. Prosecutors are left free to discriminate against blacks in jury selection, provided that they hold that discrimination to a, quote, acceptable level. And any prosecutor can easily assert facially neutral reasons for striking a juror, and trial courts are ill-equipped to second-guess those reasons. So his ability to notice the issues with Batson right away are sort of, I don't know, he's got some premonitions there. So an important aspect of that three-pronged test is the purposeful discrimination language that I pointed out earlier, which is a rejection of implicit bias, again, an embracement of colorblindness, sort of refusing to acknowledge that these implicit biases exist and we need to address them to have fair trials, fair juries, and a fair legal process. And it's also a notion that 1980s and 1990s America was this utopian, colorblind, equal society when it's not. Like, again, Batson was in 1986, right in the middle of Reagan's iteration of the war on drugs. We're ramping up on mass incarceration, which will be expounded on by the 1994 crime bill written by the current president, or co-sponsored by the current president. And then we've also got situations and rebellions like Rodney King in Los Angeles. So we're not living in a colorblind, we're all a created equal society, no matter how badly the Supreme Court in Batson wanted to frame it. And then the real world consequences of Batson were looked at in June of 2020 by the Berkeley Law Death Penalty Clinic. They looked at 683 cases throughout the state of California over a 12-year period that involved Batson challenges against peremptory challenges exercised by the prosecutors in lower courts. And in nearly 72% of the cases, prosecutors used peremptory challenges to remove African-American jurors from the jury. They removed Latinx jurors in 28% of the cases, Asian Americans in less than 3.5%, and white jurors in only 0.5% of those cases. And then the reasons for the strikes, which goes back to Batson's second prong. A lot of these were demeanor based. Oftentimes, they would claim the juror's relationship with someone involved in the criminal legal system was a reason for booting them off the potential jury. And I want to go back to, we just talked about the war on drugs and mass incarceration, and that disproportionately affects communities of color and minoritized individuals. So who do you think has a relationship with someone involved inside of the criminal legal system? Another issue that prosecutors claim was jurors expressed distrust in law enforcement and the criminal legal system and a belief that they're racially or class biased. And other reasons were dreadlocks, slouching, wearing a short skirt and blinged out sandals, visiting incarcerated family members, negative experiences with law enforcement, and where they lived, which included East Oakland, Compton, and Tenderloin. And in the cases that the Berkeley Death Penalty Clinic studied, there were over 30 years in the California Supreme Court, they found Batson violations in 2.1% of cases. And in the California Court of Appeals overall, those 683 decisions, the court only found Batson violations in 18 of them, about 2.6%. So a lot of what we believe in at the clinic and what we talk about a lot is putting a face and humanizing these individuals who are sort of become faceless, at least when it comes to studying law, become faceless. And you use Batson to refer to a Batson challenge for the cases. And we fully believe in creating humanity to these people that are, negatively impacted by the criminal legal system. So this is a picture of James Batson with his mom. And as of 2016, he was driving a truck, both local and long haul across the United States. He does some construction work on the side to help make ends meet. And he actually wrote a book called War on Jails. So if anyone is looking for anything new to read upcoming, I would recommend it. He brags to his friends pretty frequently about how there's a legal rule named after him. And in the podcast that I've cited below, he actually, tells all of his friends, go look it up in the law books. Any law book that you pick up, you're going to find the name James Batson. So with that, we've kind of entered the modern era of what the all-white jury has become. So I want to turn that over to Lauren, and thank you for your time.
Great. Awesome work, Luke. Thank you. So Luke's going to share his screen for a minute, and then I'll pop mine up. We'll see if we can make that happen. And yeah, and then I'm going to share with you really this idea that as we think about the police force being an evolution of sorry, give me 1 minute here. Let me get this up. Being an evolution of the slave patrols, we also can see that the all-white jury is just an evolution of the racial terror lynching mob. So give me 1 second. I'm going to make sure that I'm sharing my screen, and we'll get started. Sharing a window. Can you see that, Luke? Or
You have to go to Files.
okay,
From
okay.
PowerPoint, it'll give you the PowerPoint.
Video slides, share screen, window, entire screen, Chrome tab, window. All right.
And I can go back to sharing too, if that.
Yeah, maybe let's have you go back to sharing just to keep it going. And you know, kind of when I'm done with the slides. So anyway, as I was saying, this was really an evolution of the racial terror lynching mob. What happened was, as many of us know, these racial terror lynchings happened right on the courtyard of the courthouse, right at the front steps of the courthouse, and in some cases, right in front of the judge's home. These sort of pseudo judicial mechanisms by which white people thought they could try Black people in that form, that we could just try them outside the courthouse. We don't have to bring them in. And then when that became unpopular, perhaps, that's when, the system had to evolve, right? And time and again, we see that the system evolves to maintain white supremacy and the white majoritarian narrative. And that's what's happening in our courthouse, right up the street here right now. So if you doubt, okay, well, Herbert Richardson was in 1989, Lauren. No, I mean, it's 2023. We can go down the street right now and see this white majoritarian narrative happening. With much due respect to our local jurists here and judges, it's in some ways that as if it's so automatic, it's almost like they can't help it, right? The system is working as it's designed to work, as my friend pointed out to me the other day. So the all-white jury and the racial terror lynching mob are really linked by a conflation of race and criminality. So this idea that we, and I'll use the sort of royal we, like our society, our world, that we essentially think that, Blackness is criminality. It's why Black people are highly overrepresented at a disproportionate rate in traffic stops, for example, for minor investigatory stops. One study showed, and just 1 year's worth of data, that if you were Black in North Carolina, you were 63% more likely to be pulled over by police for a traffic violation. And that's not because Black people are committing more crimes. The empirical data would more than rebuke that. In fact, white people and Black people commit crimes at the same rate, and that the hit rates on these traffic stops, for example, is terrible. Right? It's not good police work to racially profile, and yet we still do. So this idea that Blackness equates to criminality, is certainly not supported by the data. Here we go. I'm now sharing, which is good. So, all right. So, here we go. So, the racial terror lynching mob, the way its attributes and what it shares with the all-white jury is that this idea of Black subjugation, right? This racial dominance, the white race dominating all other races. And it's really this new configuration after the master-slave dyad had sort of passed away. It's this new evolution, right, of that relationship, if you will. And so whites turn to the criminal justice system to manage Black people and to maintain social order. And so what we see in the criminal courthouses across the nation is this white majoritarian narrative, this idea that if I'm a white juror, I come in with stereotypical thinking. Many of our jurors actually have, grew up during the war on drugs. And I'll show you some ads and slogans from that campaign where you'll see that they were subjected to those messages. And so, of course, this idea that they don't walk through the courthouse gates and just lose all that stereotypical thinking, that unconscious bias, perhaps even what we might term reckless bias, right? It's still true and a part of who they are, right? And so those things don't shed from you just because a judge says, hey, do you think you could be fair and impartial and just listen to the law as I tell you what the law is? We don't get jurors that say, no, judge, I'll never be able to listen to you, right? And it's ridiculous. And so part of the art of being a trial attorney actually is to tell jurors it's okay to be biased. It's okay if you if you think these things, or if you're not aware even of your bias, like we all have them. And so there's this emergence of implicit bias instructions that judges are even reading these days, including, I think, Judge Friedenthal in our federal district court out in Cheyenne that says, hey, I'm biased too, right? Like, we don't lose those biases just because we come in this magic courthouse, so to speak. And those things, you got to keep those in check while you're in here. So that's at least a growing body of response anyway to this issue. But often this idea of encoding Blackness with inferiority, worthlessness, threat, all of these things, they were certainly part and parcel to the racial terror lynching mob. They are part and parcel to the all-white jury as well. This is a terrific project called 56 Men Posing in Hoodies. And its founder, Cephas Williams, wrote about the project. I am a Black man with a degree in architecture, and I find I am not taken seriously when I walk into a room full of strangers. These men that are depicted here in this project are politicians, directors, entrepreneurs, teachers, photographers, professionals, dads, brothers, cousins, best friends. This project is a terrific way to humanize Black men. But, our jurors, what they see when they see this is criminals. And whether or not they are, aware of racism and systemic racism, right? Part of the quote woke crowd these days. I'll stay away from that. But nevertheless, even if they have that level of recognition about systemic racism, still, the implicit association test that Harvard designed shows us that even those woke people still have these unconscious, unbelievable biases. How could we ever think that police officers don't have them, that jurors don't have them? It's just not possible, right? If you think that white juries is sort of a thing of the past, please think again. So a couple of studies to share with you. Out of Massachusetts in 2021, white people were 71% of the population, and they were 81% of those jurors who were impaneled. Ahmaud Arbery's jury, 11 white people, 1 African-American. Of course, some might say, hey, but that turned out okay, right? Like the bad guys got prosecuted. And I'd submit to you that that was an extreme case of vigilante, pursuit, just god-awful pursuit of Mr. Arbery, who was on a jog. Not police officers, former police officers, but not current police officers. And I think that made a difference in the verdict. I also think there's something that may be said for white guilt in extreme cases. But not all of our cases are extreme, right? They're usually in the middle, right? It's not like TV where the guy is definitely guilty or definitely innocent. We live in a very gray area in the criminal legal system. And so that matters a great deal, whether you can tip one way or the other. The racial makeup of the jury has a substantial weight, which I'll show you a little bit later. We also helped try a case on appeal here, the Stuart Yazzie case in Wyoming in 2019. Stuart is Native American, and he was tried by an all-white jury. The only 2 racial minorities out in Campbell County who were in the panel of people that they invited in to potentially be jurors were struck by the prosecutor. We raised a Batson challenge that Luke mentioned there, and we were essentially booted out of court, nicely, I suppose, by the Wyoming Supreme Court, but basically told, there's no Batson issue here. There's no race problem here. So Cedric Hobbs Jr., he had a 2014 death penalty case in North Carolina. The jury pool, this is the pool at which you would draw jurors from the community to come in and listen to a case. 50% Black, only 2 people made it onto the seated jury for Mr. Hobbs's trial. Many of you have probably heard of Curtis Flowers, who is now a free man, thank God. He was exonerated. He was tried 6 different times by this white man right here. Six different ways, and every time this white man struck black jurors, everywhere you look. So take a look at the prospective jurors, the racial composition in the final jury. So the first Flowers trial, all 12 are white. The second, 1 black juror. The third, 1 black juror. The fourth, hey, we're getting a little bit better, right? 7 white people and 5 black people, then 9 and 3, and now shoot, we're back to 11 and 1, right? This man, Mr. Evans, no repercussions whatsoever. Still an attorney. I think at one point he was running for an office out of Mississippi. Whereas Mr. Flowers spent decades in prison for a crime he did not commit. And finally, the U.S. Supreme Court said enough is enough with Mr. Evans. Please, so if you're going to prosecute Mr. Flowers again, you got to select somebody else. This guy's racist is basically what they said, although they didn't say it, right? But thankfully, Mr. Flowers was not tried again. He's a free man. So this goes back to the idea I was talking about these majoritarian narratives that were a part of the era when there was the racial terror lynching mob. They haven't changed. They sound and look different the way we talk about it and frame the narrative, but they're exactly the same. We don't so much think about what is criminal as much as who is criminal now. But back in the day, there were the black codes and black laws that were designed to criminalize black people, over criminalize black people, put them into the system so that they could be subjected to the convict leasing system under the 13th Amendment, which is authorized, of course, under the 13th Amendment. And we still, to some degree, criminalize the sort of what we criminalize is sort of leads to who we criminalize. But a lot of what I think jurors from sort of the campaign on the war on drugs and sort of beyond, they think about who is a criminal in current modern day society. And they often think of, as Elijah Anderson points out, the image of blacks, especially black men, as being a predator. And it's become this vivid shape in the public mind. Here's that war on drugs that I discussed. This was 1971. It's actually Nixon's war on drugs. We talk about Reagan a lot. It certainly was Reagan's as well. You know what? It was Jimmy Carter's. It was President Bill Clinton, if you liked him. It was President Trump, of course. It was President Obama's war on drugs as well. And it is also President Biden's war on drugs, very much so. So nobody has clean hands here in the presidency with this war on drugs. So we can attribute it back to Nixon and Reagan being maybe its primary culprit. Quite frankly, his wife, Nancy Reagan, maybe had dirtier hands on this campaign, but nobody has clean hands, not even President Obama. I want you to be, very clear on that. Don't design this like fake narrative about President Obama and who he was either, right? I mean, with much due respect, I love him. This is certainly my favorite president, but this is on his hands too and on his watch too, right? So don't lie to yourselves about maybe your heroes, right? So many jurors are old and white and retired. Why is that? Okay, that is because they have time to sit on a jury and they have the money to sit on a jury and miss work, all those things. And so a lot of these jurors lived through the war on drugs and watched the campaign ads and were subjected to the rhetoric. So public enemy number one, right? And this is a clip that was played back in the 1980s, 1986, about the war on drugs.
Hell, dude, send your mom and daddy out of the room. I gotta get you up on this. You know who I am, a snake, dealing in weed, coke, crack, your choice. Take one hit and you'll do anything to cop more. Steal from your mama, lie, cheat on your homeboys. But hey, that's the price you pay when you deal with dudes like me. Now, some folks will tell you that I'm dealing in poison. But hey, do I look like the kind of guy that would do that to a kid like you? Yes.
Yikes, right? So that's played in living rooms across America. There's President Bush. I somehow failed to mention the two Bushes, right? Their hands aren't clean either on the war on drugs. There's Nancy. She's probably the primary culprit. Poor Nancy. I'm after her today. But nevertheless, I mean, this is the kind of crap that, your parents or your grandparents or perhaps you yourself, grew up watching and were inundated with. You had DARE officers who came with bears and stuff to your classroom and taught to you about this campaign. So these are just images and things. I mean, all this stuff, it doesn't, fall out of the brain of a juror just because they walk into a courthouse. That's the whole point, right? Silence and neutrality is a really important point we need to talk about, because it was a tool, of course, for continued racial terror lynching mob. I mean, look at all these people and nobody shouting out, maybe a handful, stop the insanity. This is awful. He's innocent. This is barbaric, right? And it's the same thing in court. Judges sit there and watch why all the Black jurors are struck. I'm going to show you Judge Loper in a moment, who reigned over at least two of Mr. Flowers's trials. Was silent as to Batson or condone the peremptory challenges of all the Black jurors. Can you imagine being a judge sitting on the bench and watching, you live in a community with 50% or more is African American, and you're just slowly watching all the Black people as they get knocked off the jury, and you don't say a word? And it's the same thing. You might as well be in this crowd watching Henry Smith tortured to death, right? So these people right here are the same as the people in the crowd, right? They don't think so, but they are, right? And attorneys are just as bad. Here's the white and white attorneys at law, but no disrespect to that particular firm. I just thought it was kind of funny. But what I'm telling you is that we attorneys, we play this silence and neutrality, right? We play that role too, right? We're silent too. We're too scared to raise Batson challenges or whatever it might be. So in that way, we are accomplices as well. So the lynching passersby is the same thing as the judges and attorneys who watch jurors get, minoritized jurors get picked off the jury. This is nothing new. In fact, when there was racial terror lynching mobs, you might have wondered where all the attorneys were. They were there too. Thumbs up. Hey, cool. This looks good, right? Good judicial process. We're fine here. Here's Colonel C.J. Hodgel, a leading criminal defense lawyer at the time for Henry Smith's lynching that you just saw in several slides. I think even Madison might have had one in hers. As a lawyer and law-abiding man, I deplore mob law at all times, but there are two sides to this thing. Smith's death was simply the will of the people, and they cannot be blamed. The deed has been done, and as good citizens we must endorse it. And then Judge Durer, 1933 in Maryland, George Armwood, 23-year-old mentally ill Black man accused of attacking an elderly white woman. Of course, like most of these cases, the evidence is insubstantial, unsubstantiated. And he's arrested. He's moved to 3 different jails. He finally ends up in Somerset County, where the local officials are saying, don't worry, he's not going to get hung. We'll take care of him. Well, shortly after that, a huge mob of about 1,000 white people collected on the courtyard of the courthouse. And Judge Durer is on his way. He's on his way to dinner. He's going to be the judge of this case. He said, hey, all you white people, right? Y'all be good now, okay? Because I've got this, right? I've got this. We're going to give this man justice. It's going to be fine. And he walked off and said, yeah, I figured that they were going to be men of their word and nothing was going to happen. Within minutes, they've broken in to the jail. They used battering rams, you guys, 15-foot battering rams to get this man out of jail, right? And they drag him out. They put a noose on him and they hang him from a nearby tree near Judge Durer's house, right? So he was an accomplice, right? Just like the modern day judge is accomplice when we see these minoritized jurors getting picked off juries, right? One other thing about this silence and neutrality, and then I'll move off of it, is in Flowers, Justice Kavanaugh, this was the first opinion Justice Kavanaugh wrote. He said that the trial court is in the best situation, the judge is in the best situation to enforce Batson. So we were like, hey, that's interesting, Justice Kavanaugh. Maybe we're going to try that. So in 2021, when we're arguing Yazzie v. Stewart in front of our state Supreme Court, we say, hey, you remember what Justice Kavanaugh said? He said that the trial court was in a really good position here to enforce Batson, and the trial court failed to do that. So we think that's an error. Well, it didn't work out so good. As you'll see, the Wyoming Supreme Court said, it is certainly true that trial judges possess the primary responsibility to enforce Batson and prevent racial discrimination from seeping into the jury selection. That is a long way from saying it is the trial court judge's duty to identify and sua sponte on his or her own, root out discrimination in jury selection. We find no support for such a proposition in any precedent applying the U.S. Constitution. All right, here's Judge Loper, Judge Loper presided over the last 2 of Mr. Flowers' trials, accomplice to his lynchings previous to this. He's at this is a hearing after the sixth conviction is overturned, after the U.S. Supreme Court says enough is enough, get rid of that Doug Evans guy, right? And he says, listen, he's been condoning by the way, the prosecutors bumping off these minoritized jurors all day long. Hasn't never had a problem with it. All of a sudden he has a problem with it, right? He's basically saying, listen, the evidence is too thin for me to keep him in custody. You better straighten up, prosecution, or this case is basically going away, right? And so he sort of has this scathing opinion of the prosecutor's office after the sixth trial is overturned. So now he's pissed off, right? Now he's upset. And he's really pissed off at Attorney Hopper because guess what? Doug Evans didn't show his face, right? At this bail hearing, he sent one of his little deputies. So the deputy walks away, with his, basically just got lit into by the judge. And Doug Evans never had to take that. So all of a sudden he cares now, right? All right. Well, these courts, they serve as accomplices, and they need to be told that, right? They're accomplices too. All right. What are the harms of the all-white jury that aren't already should be common sense, right? What's beyond that? What does the research show us? Well, first, there's an increased risk of conviction, of wrongful conviction. This is Walter McMillan, who was wrongfully convicted of a murder that he did not commit and was represented by Brian Stevenson. And also, there's an increased risk of death, the death penalty. So this is a white juror wrote to a judge after following a hearing, following a jury trial. This is Judge Janet Bond Atherton, and she received this note from a white juror after reigning over a civil rights complaint filed by Black plaintiffs. So it says, during deliberations, matter of fact expressions of bigotry and broad brush platitudes about those people rolled off tongues of a vocal majority as naturally and unabashedly as if they were discussing the weather. Shocked and sickened, I sat silently, rationalizing to myself that since I did agree with the product, there was nothing to be gained by speaking out against the process. I now regret my inaction. Had just one African American been sitting in that room, the content of discussion would have been quite different. And had the case been more balanced, one that hinged on a fine distinction or subtle nuances, a more diverse jury might have made a material difference in the outcome. And then I pass these thoughts on to you and hope that the jury system can someday be improved. This was in 2008. Racial diversity in the jury affects deliberations. So there's been a substantial amount of research done, in particular by Samuel Summers, who's quoted down below or cited below. When we have racially diverse juries, they have longer deliberations. They have greater focus on the evidence, greater discussion on missing evidence. They evaluate inconsistencies more carefully, and they have a greater discussion of race-related topics. Simply by knowing that they would be serving on diverse juries as compared to all white ones, white jurors are less likely to believe at the conclusion of the evidence, but before deliberations, that the Black defendant was guilty. Here's an article which essentially makes a finding that juries formed from all white jury pools convict Black defendants significantly 16 percentage points more often than white defendants. And this gap in conviction rates is entirely eliminated when the jury pool includes at least one Black member. This is probably even a little outdated since I put this presentation together. Since 1989, there's been over 3,200 exonerations. Those are people who've been wrongfully convicted, and we've discovered that, and they've been exonerated and released from prison. It's probably getting closer to 3,500. I feel like the number changes every day. Black people are 13.6% of the American population, but 53% of the 3,200 exonerations listed here, that's what they make up that 53% of that number. So judging from exonerations, innocent Black Americans are 7 times more likely than white Americans to be falsely convicted of serious crimes. This is an instance where the Supreme Court upheld a death sentence where jurors expressed specific racial bias. A gentleman by the name of Andre Thomas out of Texas. He was a Black man sentenced to death for the murder of his wife and their biracial son. Substantial evidence of mental illness. And on the jury questionnaires where you can ask jurors different questions, they said that they opposed or vigorously opposed people of different racial backgrounds backgrounds marrying or having children, that interracial relationships were against God's will, and that people should stay within their bloodline. Those people make it onto the jury. There's Andre Thomas, who, by the way, took out one of his eyes and ate it after his conviction, and then later did the same thing. So this man here, we're set to kill him in Texas, and that's the all-white jury hanging Mr. Thomas. Indeed, with the exception of voting, for most citizens, the honor and privilege of jury duty is their most significant opportunity to participate in the democratic process. I'm often saying that African Americans are overrepresented as targets of the criminal legal system and underrepresented as participants, as decision makers, right? So it's not only just wrongful convictions, over death sentences, racism in that way, but also disenfranchisement that's similar to voting in many respects. One of the other substantial ways you participate in the democratic process, even though you might get upset when you get a jury summons, is to be a juror, right? And participate in that process. And Black Americans are being disenfranchised at an enormous rate, both before they ever make it into the courthouse, just by, the qualifications we have for jurors, then once they get in and the government or other parties striking them based on their race. What's the answer? I don't know, but I love Mariam Kaba. A persistent and seemingly endemic feature of U.S. society is the conflation of Blackness and criminality. And her father, touted collectivity because everything worthwhile is done with others. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you and other individuals who have different perspectives, which are equally as important that we, come together, collect together, and talk about these issues. That's at least the first step. So thank you so much for letting us borrow the last part of the conference and this virtual conference, and for providing us a safe space to be who we are and share our work.
Thank you so much, Attorney McLean and Mr. Luke Dante, for your contribution to this event. I'm sure if we had a physical audience, we would get a strong round of applause for this event. Thank you for those who attended today via our different streaming platforms. Today we had the chance to listen to brilliant scholars. I want to thank Dr. Bridgman and Dr. Benson again for attending today and offering opening remarks and the keynote address. Moreover, our student did a great job, I think, with their research, and also made it easy for us to follow and understand. They had the courage to ask hard questions that need to be asked, and I think that's what allows us to learn and work towards change. Of course, I want to thank also Dr. Dixon for inspiring these students and many more, and making this event possible in order to speak about these social issues. I firmly believe in the importance of continuing to ask challenging questions on the subject of transgender activism, police brutality, racial bias, and many more. And I look forward to attending our next event on the 6th of February. And I will let Dr. Dixon speak of it a little further.
What a day. Very inclusive thoughts, very diverse thoughts. First of all, to all the presenters, students. Now, remember, these are undergrads, so it is a duty amongst us as individuals who have taken an oath, if you will, about what students should be doing. We'll teach them this understanding of the baseline of what graduate rigor is in undergrad, and I'm sure they'll find themselves more inspired. All the presenters, excellent job. Thank you for Mr. Toby Thompson, who's been with us all day and helped us out as usual. Great. To the great Maya, thank you so much for making this move smoothly and being very flexible. Attorney McLean, Luke Dante, excellent job. Dr. Jackie Bridgman. And again, look for us on the 6th, which is Monday at 6 p.m. with the great Dr. Raymond Wimbush, the director of the Urban Institute at Morgan State University, one of the leading voices in America on reparations. Thank you all so much. We look to see you Monday. All right. Thank you.